want to actually attach some positive emotions to learning for people. And when you can make it relatable and you can hopefully help people laugh a little bit or tie it to some vignette or some catchphrase, then people start to retain it better. And then you catch the bug, and then maybe everybody wants to be a lipid geek. They should. I encourage it. It's fun. Are there certain people who have a coronary artery calcium score of 0 who end up having an event of atherosclerotic origin? Yes. But in West of Denmark, who were those types of people? Well, who were the people with CAC of 0 who had events? Diabetes, smoking, low HDL cholesterol. You are more likely to be broken into if you've already been broken into. And that was called plaque begets plaque in the original thing. But I would say, hey, if there's been a break-in, your lipid neighborhood's rough and your home security system wasn't adequate to prevent a break-in. And so we're looking at serial break-ins unless we move to a safer part of town.
Tell me who you are and what you do.
My name is Josh Wageman. It looks like Wageman. There's an E in there just to confuse you. And I am a husband, a father. I coach cross country. I'm a youth pastor. Those are not the reasons why I'm here today, I don't think. I basically have very few useful skills except going to school and taking tests. And I have a doctorate in physical therapy. I have a PhD studying cholesterol disturbances and Alzheimer's disease. I have a master's degree of physician assistant studies from the Yale School of Medicine. And I'm a clinical lipid specialist, and that's what I'm best known for. And I wrote a book trying to bring hilarity and clarity to cholesterol and cardiovascular disease called The Home Security System and the Lipid Neighborhood. And my goal with that is for people to laugh a little, learn a little, and then come away with a relatable framework to not have heart attacks, strokes, and dementia. And I am very, very blessed to be here today.
Thank you. Spoiler alert, I've read your book. I should say I listened to it, and I read a bit of it, particularly the updated version, because you've got a chapter on lean mass hyperresponders, which we'll certainly be getting into.
Yes.
But before we get into all of that, let's go back. How in the world, you are a very unique creature. I'll just say that you've got a mix of different things about you that I do not normally see in another human. So let's start with which came first. Was it your interest in biochemistry or your maybe not as commonly referred to as science direction?
Yeah. When people hear that background, they're very confused and they're like, wow, what are you? What are you, some magical academic centaur of sorts or something like that? And if anybody has the identical background that I do from an academic and didactic perspective, I would love to meet that person because
I haven't met one.
We're all about N of ones, right? And so, yeah, so I truly believe that God uses even adverse circumstances to catalyze what we're supposed to do when we grow up. And I'm honestly still trying to figure that out. And so the first time I went to grad school was physical therapy school. And I'll be honest, the reason I went to PT school was because I had extra eligibility to run cross country and track at Idaho State, where I had matriculated for PT school. Very shallow, but that's where I was at the time. Athletics were... 'Cause
you were very athletic in
school. Well, you realize how good you're not when you compete at the Division I level. I think I thought I was athletic. I idolized athletics. I based a lot of my identity on who I was as an athlete. I took for granted a lot of the other things and some of the other faculties that God had given me. School was always just easy for me, and I was like, all right, I'm going to go mess around, play ping pong and racquetball and anything else, and then go compete in intercollegiate sports and then show up and be able to crush it in whatever class I'm taking. I kind of took things for granted because it was easy for me. And as always, life is just a series of humbling experiences, I think. And some of us need more humbling than others. And so anyway, so the reason, though, was very shallow, why I went to PT school. And so I was competing for Idaho State in cross country and track, and it was a perfect storm, actually, of a lot of interesting events. And so before COVID-19, people may recall the swine flu, oink oink, and so the H1N1 virus. And I got the swine flu. And this was during my last season of eligibility competing for Idaho State. And I was running really, really well at the time. Can you give us
the year roughly?
Yeah, this was 2009 or thereabouts. And I was,
So this was after, I want to say by that point, the swine flu was at least what, 7, 8 years, something like that?
I'm not really sure. My expertise is in lipids, not respiratory viruses, and so, although we can talk about CD81 and PCSK9 and its relationship to viral entry into cells later, that'll be a trip. But anyway, so I'm not really sure on that. But I was running really, really well, and we had just done a 5-mile time trial at altitude, and I had run it in 25 flat, and so I was feeling pretty good about that because it was on a hilly course, and so I was feeling pretty good. And what I really wanted to do in my last season was qualify for NCAA regionals, and so I could get then smoked by the guys from Northern Arizona who are better than you and train at altitude. And so it's just obnoxious how good these guys are. It's awesome. But anyway, so I wanted to get to regionals to get smoked by NAU. And so, but then I get the swine flu like right before conference, and you have to run well at conference in order to qualify for regionals. And so I was super, super sick. And I was hacking up a lung, running 104 fever, even puking, just because why not, And so I had been running during that time. I was running about 90 to 100 miles a week, and so I had been burning the candle pretty hot and going to grad. Well, sometimes I went to class. My teachers were very concerned about me in PT school. They're like, we're a little worried about you because you just don't seem to care too much. They were right, and I needed to have a better attitude. But that's where I was at the time. I was young, immature, silly, all those things. And so I get the swine flu, and I had been probably teetering on the edge of overtraining at the same time. And I willed myself to the start line, and I ended up qualifying for regionals and passed out over the finish line, actually, in the process.
Wow.
And then, which I did multiple times. I was
passed out multiple times.
Oh yeah. I've had rhabdomyolysis, which is muscle breakdown, where it looks like you're peeing out cherry cola, at least 20 times in my life. And this is one of those things where it's like usually once is enough, because this is kind of life threatening. This is a big deal. When people get rhabdomyolysis, it's like, oh, a lot of times you end up in the hospital and you're getting IV fluids, and hopefully you're not going into kidney failure. Some of us need serial humbling in order to figure it out. And for somebody who was supposed to be smart, real dumb, real dumb. So anyway, I just thought mind over matter. I was like, well, I feel like God gave me a pretty good mind. And I figured mind over matter, that mind wins always. No, matter wins big time. And so anyway, so I end up then running at regionals, also passed out there, ran terrible, got smoked like I figured I would. Even if I would have been healthy, I would have been destroyed by those guys. They're so good. But anyway, and then honestly, everything just shut down basically. I got actually this weird thyroiditis. And so this constellation of overtraining, being really sick, and just burning it too hot, my TSH, which is a marker of thyroid function. So basically your TSH goes really high when your thyroid is not producing what it should. And so when TSH is high, that means you're severely hypothyroid, which is also kind of confusing for people because they look at me and they don't think, oh yeah, that guy's hypothyroid. Because usually people who are hypothyroid are really sluggish, and well, I don't need to tell you about my bowel habits, but people are, everything slows down. You're super bradycardic, super sluggish. People are gaining weight usually. But I got this thyroiditis. My TSH was up in like 35, something like that. It should be, between maybe 0.5 and 3.5. It was up at like 35. And so I was feeling, you don't feel well when your TSH is 35, by the way. Anybody who's out there who's had hypothyroidism, the brain fog, the I'm existing but not living is real. So I sympathize with you, and I've seen lots of patients with thyroid issues, and I definitely can empathize with you there. But anyway, so my thyroid tanked and everything else kind of tanked, and then I started having recurrent rhabdomyolysis, this acute muscle breakdown. And there's a constellation of factors that resulted in that. But basically, I got really, 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 really sick. And it was really bizarre because it's like, okay, you got this guy who's, I wouldn't say an elite athlete, but really high-level performer. And you've taken him, and now he can't go up a flight of stairs without almost passing out. And I was super sick. And I missed so much class that I had to take a medical withdrawal as well. And I had to discontinue. I couldn't finish my final track season because I got so sick, and I basically failed. I failed. I colossally failed. And that was the first time in my life that I had ever just completely been broken. And that's where I needed to be, because I had taken for granted how blessed I was and how easy things were for me. And I just figured if I kept showing up, then, I would just mind over matter, right? Absolutely not. And I realized how fragile I was. And I went back, and during that time away from school, I worked with special needs kids. And it was exactly what I needed to reset everything. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was actually considering going back to med school at that time. And what's funny is when you're flunking out of school and people are asking you why you didn't go to med school, that's also a weird paradox, which is what my teachers were asking, because they're like, this guy we think is smart, but he just doesn't seem to care. Also, they were confused by me. And I was honestly in a weird state myself, because I had based so much of my identity on my athletic prowess, and that had been taken away from me, basically. And so I remember, though, just praying, and I was like, God, forgive me for being such a knucklehead and such a poor steward of what you've given me. Please save me from myself and help me actually not be so selfish and use what you've given me to help other people. And I remember praying that distinctly while I was lying on a couch, just feeling like I was dying. And from there, obviously there's nothing mystical about this, but I slowly regained my health. I just hung out with special needs kids. We would make mixtapes. I miss mixtapes. Mixtapes were so great. Everything's on Spotify now. I'm like,
Artifact of the past.
And like Kazaa and LimeWire, those were the days, man, where you would get home from school and you would have your clunker computer where you didn't care if it had 108 viruses on it, and you would go and LimeWire it up, and then eventually it would crash. You get the blue screen of death, but hopefully before that you got some real fire songs, But anyway, so I would make mixtapes for my little buddies of Barney mainly, and the Grease soundtrack and things that they would like, and we would rock out to that, and I would just try to help them with their IEP goals and some of their social goals and things like that. And it was a beautiful time, and it made me just reevaluate how blessed I was. And so I didn't really know what I was going to do. I was actually considering going back to seminary at that time, going to PA school, going to med school. I didn't think I was actually going to go back to PT school at that time. And I remember calling my friend, Lucas. I've been the guy in the basement many times in my life. And so I've just crashed on people's love sacks and beanbag chairs and couches and been that guy in the basement. And I called up my friend Lucas, and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about going back to PT school. I'm only coming back, though, if I can stay in your basement. And he's like, oh, yeah, that's great. And so that was the decision. That was it. And so then I was like, okay, I'll go back to PT school. And so I went back, and then I ended up finishing physical therapy school.
Let me just interject one thing. So
yeah.
You were getting better, but you didn't have a particular catalyst as to why, beyond just reaching out and asking for it.
It was interesting, because during that time, though, I saw a lot of doctors and no one could figure it out. It was strange. It was some really bizarre endocrine stuff. And some of the labs made pretty much zero sense. Even my adrenal labs, and so ACTH, my ACTH was north of 130 at one point, which that's very consistent with adrenal Cushing's. And obviously I didn't have Cushing's.
I just have to say, I think people who don't understand, like, we shouldn't spend too much time on this.
Yeah.
But for as little as I know about a lot of the things that you're discussing, I do know that it is quite serious what you're describing. Like, when you're talking about you're literally excreting the protein, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's like in
breakdown
buckets.
Muscles are breaking down big time.
It's not like soreness. It's not like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit of soreness and it's affecting my athletic ability. You're not just experiencing this physically. I can't imagine the mental fortitude you've got to have to recognize what's happening to your body and to be confronting that at such a young age. Like, I just can't even comprehend that.
And some of it still doesn't make sense, and I just believe I needed it just to shake me out of my selfishness. And so some of it still just doesn't quite make sense, the magnitude of how sick I was. It really doesn't. And there were a lot of smart people trying to figure this out, and they really didn't have any answers. But it was during that time that I was like, well, I'll try to figure it out then. And then I got into endocrinology and biochemistry. I was like, dang, this stuff is really cool. And did I ever truly figure out my own stuff? I have some ideas, but not really. But in the process of trying to learn about the things that were affecting me, I've been able to help so many people with their stuff because people make a lot more sense than I do. So anyway, so it fostered this love of endocrinology. I finished PT school. There was never a sense of finality that I was done, though. And so I worked as a physical therapist for many years. And one of the more rewarding things that I enjoyed with physical therapy is neurologic rehab, people with Parkinson's. And I mean, movement is medicine, motion is lotion, whatever catchphrase you want to use. And you can really get people's lives back via the power of movement. And I love moving. I believe God gives us bodies to move and minds to learn. So why stop doing either of those things? And that also helps your metabolic health more than anything too. And so anyway, so I got in love with biochemistry and endocrinology and all these things. And I figured at that time, the quickest means to my end was going to go to PA school rather than med school. And so I went to the Yale School of Medicine. It was awesome. It was fantastic. Had a blast with PA school. Actually applied myself, and the shift there for me was I wasn't just trying to get a grade anymore. I actually wanted to master content. And that was a big shift. And it wasn't just because I wanted to have some degree of expertise in the matter on a personal note. It was because if I'm going to help people to the best of my abilities and they deserve my best, I'm going to pour myself into this. And that was a big shift for me. And it is fun learning. And it's fun to try to master stuff knowing that you never will. And then during that time too, I had a patient cancel, and I'm always reading stuff, and I pull up this article, and it has this obnoxiously condescending title, like Basics of Lipids and Lipoproteins. I'm like, okay, come on. I'm pretty hip on my pentose phosphate pathway here, name my motorcycle Krebs. And so I feel like, I know biochemistry, I thought. And I read this, what's supposed to be a rudimentary review of lipids, and I barely understood any of it, and it made me mad. And I was like, okay, unacceptable. So that's when I poured myself into being a lipid specialist, and I wish there was a better reason for that as far as a humanitarian reason. But you know what? Hey, that's okay. And I feel like in the process of trying to learn all the lipid things, which you never will, it's like trying to beat the guys from Northern Arizona at a track meet. You end up learning a bunch of stuff, and hopefully you're able to help some people along the way there. Because, I've been blessed to learn a whole bunch of stuff about lipids. I learn things every day, and there's still so much to learn and explore. And I think the exploration and the journey itself is probably the most beautiful part. And then the people you meet along the way, those are the real priceless gifts. And so anyway, I also, during this time of going back to PA school and then practicing clinically in endocrinology, I've seen thousands of patients in endocrinology and also in lipids. I was working on my PhD as well because I couldn't help myself, because I was like, well, I'm investing myself in all these lipids and cholesterol disturbances and Alzheimer's, because I think that the neurodegenerative disease is really the kind of the final frontier, and there's a big difference between living and existing. And so anyway, so I ended up working on that and completing that as well. So anyway, all these things and this crazy, long, tangential, ridiculous story, but I've been very blessed. And I continue to be very blessed to continue learning and to continue meeting amazing people along the way who share that passion for learning. And I hope that as I continue to learn, I can hopefully inspire people to learn as well. Because, man, this stuff is really cool, and you get into it, and it's intimidating at first, like when I read that article, but if you really invest yourself in it, and, I try to make it fun, because most people, they don't look back fondly on, oh yeah, biochem class, that was the best time of my life. It was for me, but I'm weird, and most people don't like textbooks. I do. Those are some of my closest friends, some of my only friends maybe, but I want to actually attach some positive emotions to learning for people. And when you can make it relatable and you can hopefully help people laugh a little bit or tie it to some vignette or some catchphrase, then people start to retain it better. And then you catch the bug, and then maybe everybody wants to be a lipid geek. They should. I encourage it. It's fun. So that's kind of where we're at today.
And of course, this is a long form podcast, so we can go on as long a tangents as you have time for. Let's let's start with that. So you determined that you're going to write this book. How long have you been in the process? Actually, let's go back a little bit further.
Yeah.
At what point did you decide to commit, getting to what you just alluded to commit not just to write this book, but that you were going to carry an analogy all the way through it?
It happened pretty organically, and what I was trying to do was explain things to my patients, the why behind something, because I've always felt like I'm a doctor or whatever credential you may have is a really lousy reason for telling somebody that you should listen to you, you know? And for me, I think the magic's in the person, not the credential, always. And I was like, well, I need to have a good, strong rationale for recommending these things because these people's lives are at stake. And all our goals are the same as far as, does anyone want to have heart attacks? No. Does anyone want to have strokes? No. Does anyone want to have dementia? Now everybody's paying attention. You know, obviously, those are our goals. No matter who you are, no matter how you feel like you're going to get there, yeah, we all share that common goal. And we all want to optimize our quality of life. All of us. And so I wanted to convey these things from a lipid standpoint to people that, hey, this is why I feel like this is the best intervention for you, given your context. And it kind of developed from there. I started using this just with my patients. I was like, hey, you know, for everybody who doesn't want to have heart attacks, strokes, and down the line dementia, I want you to have a great home security system. And I want you to live in a safe lipid neighborhood. Home security system, 4 basic pillars: normal blood sugar, normal blood pressure, keep inflammation low, and don't do drugs. Those are bad. But then your lipid neighborhood, well, this is your cholesterol panel. Because every ApoB containing particle, the vast majority of those being LDL particles, are potentially criminals that can infiltrate your arterial abode. And then what's this LP little a guy? Oh yeah, those are potentially the felons, because per particle, they may be about 6.5 times as atherogenic as your run-of-the-mill LDL particle. Okay, well, we can always measure these parameters of glucose metabolism. And hey, control your insulin, control your life is one of my mantras. It's not just normal glucose. It's also mitigating hyperinsulinemia. And so we're always focused on controlling blood pressure. Life is not better more inflamed than inflamed, although we will definitely get into the context of inflammation, and that's a really
looking forward to
really interesting topic, and I love that because it's not quite as simple there. But if your body resents your chronic state of overnutrition and it's mounting an inflammatory response to that, then that's bad. And then drugs. I mean, today is Monday. Tomorrow it's going to be Tuesday. People are going to listen to this podcast on probably all the days of the week. Whatever day of the week that you end up listening to this, not a good day to start doing drugs, you know? So anyway, those are axioms. There are very few things in biology that are like you can really take to the bank, but I feel real good about control your insulin, control your life. That's why I make shirts. And so these things, these 4 pillars, which I'm very, very bullish on as far as metabolic health, I would always explain these to my patients. But then your cholesterol panel, you know, people don't live on paper. And so it might look on paper, just with sheer numbers, that you're living in a rough inner city neighborhood on paper, but you don't live on paper. So one of my catchphrases, I need to make sure it's this or something, is got plaque? Get a CAC. You know, what's a CAC? Coronary artery calcium score. It's the colonoscopy of the heart without the nasty pregame show, because low-dose CT scan, you know, you lay down and then it shows if you have calcified plaque in your coronaries or not, which is a late finding in that process. And what's nice about this is anybody who's done a bowel prep for colonoscopy, I mean, that will temporarily ruin your social life and probably destroy your bathroom. And it's not that fun. But with a CAC, hey, you just lay down and take a breath in, and then, hey, you know, you get some really good data. Because if you've been broken into, well, and we'll talk about this in, you know, my framework, I think it's reasonable to consider moving to a nice, safe, gated community with fewer lipid criminals. But if you have a, you know, coronary calcium score of 0, especially in midlife, I mean, you know, asymptomatic person, they're probably more likely to get mauled by a rabid pack of wolves, you know? And so really, you know, you're feeling pretty good about stuff. But always, you know, we're still focusing on our parameters of glucose metabolism and normalizing blood pressure and some of those other biomarkers that we'll get into that can inform us of the metabolic milieu that we're dealing with. And so it kind of grew from there. And I just was using this with all my patients, and they seem to be understanding it. And I was like, that's good. I want people to understand. People were vibing with me, or at least pretending to, you know, pretending to be my friend. That's nice. And so they seem to be getting it. And so I just started, when I started being adjunct faculty at various medical programs and things, I started using that. And then I think metaphors resonate with people. And I think that seemed to catch fire. And so people started telling me, dude, you should write a book. Because, I go and I start talking about stuff, and I don't know, I think at least some people find me interesting, which I think is better than being boring. And so I was using all these things, and some of my colleagues actually at work were like, dude, you got to write a book, man. Got to write a book. Got to write a book. And after about 10, 15 people told me to write a book, I was like, okay, fine. And so wrote a book.
Both you and I have read Peter Attia's Straight Dope on Cholesterol series of blog posts. I think that was the first and last time until your book that I read something that seemed to have some fun and inject some humor and some like liveliness, if you will, some character. Your book, I think, does an excellent job of keeping it fresh and interesting. You crack a number of jokes. Listening to the audio version, I think I would highly recommend anybody else do, because I think you kept it very accessible, but at the same time, get into a lot of the nuances, a lot of the complexity. And I give it my strongest endorsement as a way for somebody to come into particularly not only discussing lipids, but I really enjoyed, of course, how much emphasis you have on metabolic health. Because something that I'm sure if you've been listening to me in this podcast at all, I feel as though there's plenty of room for people who both believe fully in the lipid hypothesis and then those who are a bit more skeptical. Where I feel a bit of frustration is I feel too often there are a lot of people feel like lipids are all you have to conquer, and then you don't have to worry about heart disease. Like, the problem is all the things you were discussing, stroke, dementia, not just the heart attacks, but all of these other things that have often an improvement in outcomes when you improve metabolic health are all worth discussing. Now, the challenge is that there's just a lot that can be done with lipids pharmacologically. And so when you're coming into the medical space, which you kind of look as though you've got a foot on both sides, right? You're very keenly aware of the metabolic health component with regard to health outcomes, but also you have another foot that's deeply inside the medical space.
Sure.
Do you find that this has brought around some conflicts that you have to work out?
Yeah, there always is, but at the same time, I think that we just have to evaluate all of the factors that may contribute to atherosclerosis. Now, I do believe that you cannot have atherosclerosis without an ApoB containing lipoprotein infiltrating the subendothelial space of the arterial intima and then kicking off the maladaptive immune response that results in foam cells migrating in, fatty streaks, and plaque formation, and that subsequently can rupture. So ApoB, it's part of the process, right? But how it got there is another story as far as why did the mailman break in, so to speak. And I think that if you can maintain metabolic health, you're much more likely or less likely to get broken into. That said, it's a fallen world, and there are people who get, quote, broken into who don't have any markers of impaired glucose metabolism or impaired substrate utilization. Some of that is probably because they didn't check it well enough, as far as some of these studies go. Maybe PISA, but still, there are some of these guys. I mean, I have friends who super fit athlete guys, Lp(a). They picked the wrong parents when it comes to Lp(a). I have a friend, chapter 6 of my book, who he wasn't even insulin resistant by my standards, which is hard to do, especially when we get NMRs and we can look at your subfractionations and see if you've got things that are portending signs of early insulin resistance there. None of that. HSCRP was 0.4, perfect blood pressure, really high cardiorespiratory fitness, but wasn't an excessive exerciser, because that's an interesting topic as far as the excessive CAC.
I like talking about that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And that's an unsolved mystery, and I want to make some headway on that and get some good data sets there. That's an interesting topic, really interesting. But he wasn't that guy who was doing like ultras every week and stuff and burning the candle too hot that you couldn't make a positive adaptive response to the imposed stressor, in my opinion. And so, he was looking good, and also didn't do drugs. That's good. Don't do that for all the kids out there. And so,
just a quick aside.
Yeah,
I love that you make that literally one of the pillars. Like it's. I feel as though it's another one of those things that is unintentionally minimized, but it's worth bringing up that it's a component, right? Like one of my favorite lines that you had in the book gets back to alcohol, where you said, I have it written down somewhere. It was like, I find it odd that I'm paraphrasing, but you find it odd that you have to justify why it is that you abstain from methanol, right?
Yeah, which is funny because it's like mayonnaise. And I say something about mayonnaise where it's like, if you don't want mayonnaise on a sandwich, you don't have to explain yourself away. Oh, yeah, Uncle Jerry, he really got into mayonnaise, wrecked his life. I don't want to go down that road, I mean, but with alcohol, I mean, you're in a social setting and
we got shots, Josh.
Yeah, and I'm like,
Take
oh,
yours.
no, thanks. And everybody just looks at you like, what is wrong with you? And so anyway, but yeah, it is interesting how you have to explain these things. And then, I mean, I do youth ministries. It is shocking, though, when I just asked kids a couple weeks ago, I was like, so how do you guys feel about drugs? I mean, we always say don't do drugs, but what do you guys think? And they're like, and it wasn't a slam dunk, don't do them. And so we had a good talk about not doing drugs. And these things that seem like axioms, maybe not so much. And so anyway, yes, don't do drugs. Those are bad. And then, of course, and basically people love to hear good news about their bad habits. And people like to rationalize doing things that intuitively you would think, yeah, it's probably not a great idea, and the same with diet, right? When you drive through Krispy Kreme, are you thinking, you know what, this is the day I have turned my diet around, this is a great choice for me? And you intuitively know this is a terrible choice, but people still do it. And so anyway, some of these things that you would think are just kind of common intuition, maybe not so much. And so sometimes you just got to say them.
But part of why I like zeroing in on this one is because you're acknowledging in the book, and certainly I would here, that there's a social pressure component.
Oh, yeah.
As to why it is you wouldn't feel as safe to bring up something that people might have a strong opinion on. So here's a good example. I do neither of these. I don't smoke marijuana, nor do I drink. But for what it's worth, if I'm putting together a tiering list, I would say alcohol is almost certainly worse for you on net. Obviously, it depends on the degree of consumption. But I feel social pressure to not even bring that up, even if I don't really do either one of those, because of how much I know alcohol is popular, right?
Yeah.
And that's the irony.
Yeah. This is actually really funny. So there was a guy who texted me, a great guy, and he started reading my book. And he is visiting Europe, and he was in a pub in Ireland, and he's like, loving your book over a pint. And I looked at, and he was still in the first chapter, which is the Control Your Insulin, Control Your Life chapter. And I'm like, oh boy, once he flips a couple pages, he might not be liking this so much anymore, because that's when I rip on alcohol. And so nicely, because I'll still be your friend if you choose to imbibe, but I can't recommend that as a good idea. If you're trying to optimize performance and health, really, there's really not any good reason to do that. So anyway, so I thought that was really funny though, because I'm like, oh, well, he likes me for now. We'll see in a couple days here. So if I never hear from him again, I'll know what happened. But it is interesting, and there are so many factors that result in a potential break-in, right? And like back to my buddy, who his one risk factor is Lp(a), and when he got a CAC, 2,814.
Wow.
2,814. One risk factor.
Can I ask how old he is?
At the time he got that, I believe he was 49. And so, but what's crazy, his family history was telling me a terrible story. And his 10-year risk calculator, which 10-year risk calculators, even the 30-year risk calculators, it's like, great, you're using a crappy risk calculator sooner. I mean, I don't like those risk calculators. And anything that you're plugging into a computer and expecting the computer to spit out what you're supposed to do, no, you need to understand the individual utility of each biomarker. And so anyway, so his 10-year risk calculator, though, was 2.3%. I mean, what did his doctor do? Attaboy, doing great, crushing it. Go get him, Tiger.
Was the risk calculator including CAC or no?
No, but even with the MESA risk calculator where you include CAC, it would have still underestimated his true risk. He had to have a 5-vessel CABG, so a coronary artery bypass graft. He had 5 vessels that had significant obstruction, and he had to have that done. And
okay, so yeah. I do want to level set this for the audience for a little bit, because obviously now that we're getting into CAC, by CAC we're talking coronary artery calcification. That is when you actually can see calcification in the coronary arteries. And the reason a CAC is great, and you mentioned colonoscopy of the heart or something like that.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more of a friendly term that they were using 30 years ago that we actually talk about in the movie, which is a mammogram of the heart.
Okay,
it's about the same amount of radiation.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it's about 50% more, but basically 150% of the radiation of a mammogram. Once you know that, I mean, if you have any concerns about heart disease, I try to always caution, no medical advice, nothing on this podcast or any podcast should be taken as medical advice, but goodness sakes, that's such a low dose of radiation now, whereas before, 30 years ago, you had to take a lot more radiation.
Yep.
The dosage is so low now that if there's a concern, you might want to consider it. That study out of Denmark with the 23,000...
West Denmark?
Yes.
Yeah.
That showed how close the correlation was between CAC and CT angiogram was like such a game changer for me. And this was a symptomatic population. And that is not to say that a 0 CAC means you don't have soft plaque at all, just that study of the 23,000 symptomatic patients showed just how tight it is, that if you're not wanting the gold standard of a CT angiogram, but you're wanting to at least get some sense of it, oh my gosh, a CAC just seems like such a no-brainer is no-brainer.
It really does. And, no test is perfect, okay? But
Right.
CAC is so good. And the thing is, I mean, if you're a 12-year-old kid, CAC's not going to be useful, right? And so we have to understand the limitations and when to get these tests. But the mean age of incident CAC in white males in a recent study was 36. Holy smokes. I mean, that's pretty young, right?
The mean age, so like 50% or more would have a positive CAC?
So in the cohort that they looked at, and the mean age of that cohort was 36, and that was the mean age where they started to be able to identify coronary artery calcium. I mean, that's so young. And so for me, I used to say my general approach to prevention, because we want to be preventive rather than reactionary, was, hey, age 40, get your first CAC, fire up a 0, check back in 3 to 5 years, depending on your risk factors. Well, now...
So a zero score means there is no detectable calcification in the coronary arteries.
Correct.
And there's this term, Karam Nassir and others use, the power of 0.
Mm-hmm.
And his research does suggest that it is about a 5-year. Like if you're playing it safe, if you get a CAC of 0, playing it safe, probably 5 years from then is when you could retest to check. But 0 does mean a lot in this case.
It certainly does. I would say in a younger person, the power of non-zero is very powerful because Cardia, and this is a different consortium, age 32 to 46, anybody who had a score above 0, any non-zero score, those people had a 5x risk of a premature event. And so if you're young, you shouldn't have a positive CAC. But if you do, holy smokes, I think we should aggressively intervene to, in my way, get you living in a safer lipid neighborhood.
And that's why I mentioned, you're right, and a lot of people say this, that there's not much value in getting a CAC when you're younger. You mentioned like a 12-year-old, but this has been brought up before in my own family and friends, where is there a reason to get a CAC before 40? And my personal opinion, not advice, is if I have a family history chock full of heart disease, right? Like I've got, uncles, grandparents, etc. Heart disease is rampant in our family.
Yep.
I might be a little more likely to get it before 40 because, yes, I'd like to at least confirm that it's a 0.
Yeah.
Because exactly to what you said, if there's calcification in the heart before 40 that's picked up by a CAC, I think you really want to know about that.
Exactly. And here's the thing. So let's say that you have a hereditary predisposition to colon cancer, and you have one of these conditions that results in excessive polyposis. Well, you get your colonoscopy way sooner than 45, which is across the board, everybody's recommended at 45. Start and get your first colonoscopy then. So you'll be way younger if you have Lynch syndrome or something like this, and you will start your colonoscopy sooner because of your family history. I think a similar approach ought to be considered for CAC. And back to West Denmark. So some people, I mean, and everybody, it's rare, but are there certain people who have a coronary artery calcium score of 0 who end up having an event of atherosclerotic origin? Yes. But in West of Denmark, who were those types of people? Well, who were the people with CAC of 0 who had events? Diabetes, smoking, low HDL cholesterol. Oh my goodness, what do we got there? And the reason for that is that's a harbinger of insulin resistance. And I think it will be really fun to talk about the reasons why we typically see low HDL cholesterol in the context of metabolic syndrome, diabetes, insulin resistance, because I think that physiology is fascinating and it can tell you a lot, although there are many, many peculiarities to HDL cholesterol, and it's very complicated.
Yes, well, you brought this up in the book, and I even made a note of it, which is something I get a bit pushbacky on when people are saying high HDL is bad. You brought up the importance of alcoholism. Alcoholism is, and I think there's even a study that I was looking at that in the early stages of alcoholism, components that connect the lipid energy model seem to be in play, that there's a greater catabolic rate of, I'd have to look at it again, but basically it resulted in a greater amount of HDL for a time. There's kind of seemingly a phased-based process where the HDL is higher for a while until it's fully broken loose into hypertriglyceridemia, and then the HDL comes back down again. So for a period of time, the alcohol seems to, if you think HDL is just universally good in all circumstances, beneficial. I definitely don't think so. I always want to see studies where HDL is high, but where they excluded alcoholism, so that you could absolutely confirm that that is the nature of the association. But that's going to become important for the models. Let's if you don't mind, let's jump into the models because we're going to want to chat about that part anyway.
Let's do it. Yeah.
There's first of all, the lipid energy model. Most people who listen will know or be somewhat familiar with the lipid energy model because it's come up so much in the other podcasts. But I'm going to say the cool thing about having you here, something I know a lot of the listeners are going to be excited about, is your co-authoring with, we're going to have to give the flowers to Jorge.
Lipofan. Shout out. First of the day, first of probably 19 or so.
Easily.
Yeah, Lipofan, brilliant. The movie Beautiful Mind should be about you, my friend.
So Lipofan is his Twitter/X handle. His name
is Jorge Gonzalez.
Jorge Gonzalez. And we all acknowledge he's fantastic, is constantly dropping all kinds of tidbits on the research that he's looking into, makes these amazing threads. Also, my good friend Austin Dudensky speaks with him all the time.
My friend too.
Yes, fair enough.
Our friend.
All the four of us have exchanged much lipid, research, discussion, etc. But all that said, Jorge, I think, is absolutely far and away above us as far as just constantly posting and going through the research and so forth. He's put together, with your help, I can say competing model, right? Like there's components of this other model that, while it has other aspects that the lipid energy model is not addressing quite as overtly, there's some things that qualifiably, if true about that model, would disprove the lipid energy model. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think a lot of it could be considered complementary,
right.
But I would say that there are some facets of our framework that we are skeptical that the lipid energy model fully explains.
And this is where, like, I can't emphasize enough, it's a safe space. I absolutely want to get into it. And for what it's worth, if there's anything that destroys the two coupling components of the lipid energy model, I want to know. And I want it proven as fast as possible so I can get on with the rest of my life. So component number one is there's a greater trafficking of fuel. How is that happening? Well, I won't get into the whole cascade, but I'll say a crucial qualifier is that there's more triglyceride export coming out of the liver in this state of being fat adapted, and that we see this predominantly with lean mass hyperresponders. So just a quick recap: if hepatic glycogen levels in the liver are lower from a carbohydrate restriction, not that they're empty, but as it gets below a certain threshold, once that happens, you actually have a cascade of things from there that affects the thyroid and many other aspects that ultimately result in greater fatty acid turnover within the body, particularly with the adipocytes, with the fat cells. The fat cells need to both release and be repleted of their fat stores. How is that done? Well, of course, chylomicrons from the diet that comes from the gut. Those are the lipoproteins that are coming from the gut. Those are the ApoB 48. But importantly, the ones that we're focused on, because they will result in the thing we're very interested in, are the VLDLs. They come from the liver. So this state of being more fat adapted, more lipolytic activity, means that the VLDL are going to be synthesized and secreted at a faster rate in this context, especially of lean mass hyperresponders, coupled with a faster turnover in the periphery. So particularly adipocytes themselves, they need to be repleted more frequently, more rapidly, to match the amount that's coming out on the other side. Now, I think one key misconception is, and I think this may have happened with Jorge, and I think you, and this might have been something I corrected with both of you from before, is there's been this assumption that that becomes the predominant supplier of the fatty acid fuel in the periphery, as opposed to free fatty acids that are being released, particularly from adipocytes and so forth, which is not the case. The lipid energy model posits that those two coupled things, the VLDL triglyceride secretion coupled with the turnover in the periphery, are the two major components, but that, and maybe we don't state it as well as we should in the paper, but that's still the primary supplier, or I should say the primary acceptor of those triglycerides from VLDL are going to be adipose tissue and potentially cardiomyocytes. So I don't think get into it there as well, but I think whatever diet you're on, cardiomyocytes are going to take up triglycerides off of VLDL predominantly much more than they would, say, glucose or other things. But adipose tissue is the key consumer. Now, I'm going to emphasize what I think are the major components of your model. You correct me where I'm wrong.
Yeah.
The free fatty acids that are being released in a state of carbohydrate restriction, same thing, greater fatty acid turnover, greater net release of fatty acids from adipocytes.
Yes.
Right? And this creates a flood, I think is the way that you guys are describing it, in the liver of fatty acid accumulation. And to prevent lipotoxicity, there's a need by the liver to export and to get them back out. And that this results in greater direct secretion of LDL particles. And so a key phenotypic difference between my model, or our model, and your model, I should say, is that the reason for the greater preponderance of LDL particles in this model is due to the turnover of the redelivery of triglycerides predominantly. In this model, it's due predominantly to the secretion, the direct secretion of LDL particles. Do I have that part right?
Yeah. So I think, and there's a lot of moving pieces here.
I know.
So I'm going to try to consolidate it and organize it in a way that we can all follow, because what's hilarious too is at one point we were both, Jorge and I were drawing out everything going on, and it was like we needed a full poster board of this because there's so many moving pieces. And then there's a lot of other theoretical things as far as the ANGPTL family and things like that that are more in the weeds. But for right now, it's a low insulin state. People who are on a ketogenic diet, this is a chronically low insulin state, and that we're in agreement. So insulin, control your life, is a storage hormone. Okay. And so when you eat, insulin should go up and put the, clothes in the suitcase. And then when you haven't eaten, insulin should be low. And another function of insulin. So a lot of people out there, they just think, insulin makes your blood sugar go down. Well, it's true. It does. But what insulin does is everything basically, but it suppresses lipolysis. And so in the fat cell, the insulin signaling in the fat cell is to prevent excessive lipolysis, because the fat cell has all these free fatty acids and you want to, keep them in, keep them stored. And so when insulin is non-existent, aka diabetic ketoacidosis, these kiddos, and they're super as lean as it gets, and they're dying, and they're cachectic, they have no insulin on board. They get, you should see some of the lipid levels in those kids. It's terrible. And then you give them some insulin, and then it normalizes. And so insulin actually has an important function in the fat cell of suppressing lipolysis. And so when we have, one of the core tenets of our framework is this is a chronically low insulin state. And so we are going to have greater free fatty acid release from the adipocyte. I think very similar to what, the lipid energy model would say the same thing, I would say.
Right.
And so we have this chronically low insulin state. And we also have a state where the liver needs to take care of the liver. So the liver is going to be like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to not drown in fatty, sterol, and free fatty acid gravy. And so because the liver, look out for number one, and all these organs and tissues, they are mainly directed by insulin and the other nuclear transcription factors regulated by insulin to do whatever it is they're going to do. And so if we look at the sickest of the sick, which would be type 2 diabetes, they also have unsuppressed lipolysis. So their fat cells, they have all the insulin on board you would think they need, but they're insulin resistant. Their fat cells are not getting the insulin signal. So what happens in the fat cells for people with type 2 diabetes, they also get fatty acids flooding back to the liver, but insulin is high. And there's this thing of selective insulin resistance, because the liver still gets the insulin signal to do something with those fatty acids. And what does it do? It turns on SREBP1C, which is a lipogenic enzyme. So you get all this fatty liver. People with type 2 diabetes, they always have fat around their organs. Fatty liver, fatty heart, fatty pancreas, fat everywhere around your organs, no good. And so we don't like that. And that leads to all sorts of terrible inflammatory cascades. But it's because insulin is high. Insulin is a regulator of SREBP1C in the person with diabetes. Because insulin's high and the liver has all these fatty acids, what's it going to do? Create fat. And primarily palmitic acid. And so it's going to turn on de novo lipogenesis because insulin is high in that person. And all that acetyl-CoA is going to be carboxylated via acetyl-CoA carboxylase, which is also a step in fatty acid synthesis. And so the context is different. The free fatty acids are coming back to the liver, but insulin is up in those people. And so you're getting a whole bunch of lipogenesis. Well, in the lean mass hyperresponder, this person's insulin levels are low. You're getting all these free fatty acids, and the liver's like, well, normally, if I had high insulin on board, I would just create fat. Not getting that signal. So what's it going to do? I don't want to drown in fat. I'm going to take care of myself. And so it has to find alternative ways to deal with the deluge. And so there's a few things it can do. And so it can actually shuttle out ketone bodies. And so, the free fatty acids come back and it's oxidized and you have acetyl-CoA. And so acetoacetyl-CoA synthetase can shuttle out ketone bodies. And also it can, this is Max Peterson's substrate push model, is the same acetyl-CoA precursor is also the cholesterol synthetic precursor. And so he thinks that via acetoacetyl-CoA synthetase, you can get some cholesterol synthesis via that route. I'm not sure about that. It's possible. And so those are things that it can do with it. But what we believe is really happening is it's using the free fatty acids for cholesterol esterification. And it's actually creating cholesterol esters in the liver because that's a storage form of cholesterol. And it's if there's free cholesterol, there is a hydroxyl group at the third carbon in the first ring of the cholesterol molecule. But if you replace that hydroxyl group with a fatty acid, then it's esterified. And that's another way that the liver can combat any potential lipotoxicity, and it's not necessarily dependent on insulin to be able to save itself. And so we believe that all of this flood of fatty acids to the liver is leading to excessive ACAT2 esterification. And what's interesting too is when you treat cells when they do hepatocyte studies and they treat cells with LDL, it increases cholesterol esterification by something like 280%, and ACAT2 activity increases by about 870%. So the LDL particles that are coming back to the liver tend to preferentially be steered over towards esterification. And what do you need for esterification? You need fatty acids. And so part of the liver saving itself in the low insulin state is because of this esterification. And that's what's happening in our model. Now, there are some other peculiarities too with what's going on postprandially. And so we have all...
Can I pause you for a sec?
Yes, there's a lot there.
I know. And we got to kind of stay within one domain at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And part of why I wanted to steer it towards the internal domain, because we will. I know where you're going with the GI. We'll get back to that in a sec. Is a key component that I was asking you about last night before we recorded, and I also sent out a text in a group chat to check Jorge's opinion on this, is whether he also would agree that on net, the process you just now described, on net, categorically, we can say, okay, but this will disagree with the lipid energy model because the lipids are not getting reesterified into triglycerides, the fuel-based version of fatty acids for delivery on net toward a net increase of export, right?
Yes.
That's an important qualifier because if there is enough cholesterol synthesis, because I don't think the lipid energy model necessarily disputes whether there's greater cholesterol synthesis, that there almost certainly would need to be for a net increase in ApoB lipoprotein production, because you need those cholesterol esters, both for the shape and everything else. The larger question is the cargo itself, that is the fat-based fuel, is the triglycerides itself. Now, I think I could make the case for you right now that you're probably going to have to at least concede there's some marginal increase, because where else would the fatty acids that are coming from adipocytes ultimately land? Unless your model is assuming all the net increase in the lipolysis that comes from being on a low-carb diet, all of it is functionally those non-esterified fatty acids being delivered to oxidative tissues instead of carbohydrates. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think, so we have a lot of esterification. So it's driving really ramping up esterification. And also what I almost got to was the direct secretion of LDL particles. So once it's esterified, it can be directly secreted as an LDL particle. And even 38% of people with normal lipemia, 38% of LDL particles are not products of VLDL IDL hydrolysis. And so this will tend to go up as plasma triglycerides go down, is the direct secretion of LDL particles.
But the research you're describing is associational, right? Or are these tracer determined?
There were some kinetic studies. And so, so there are kinetic studies that show this, and it's inversely proportional to plasma triglycerides. And so we feel that when triglycerides, because lean mass hyperresponders, they have low triglycerides because they're insulin sensitive. And so we believe that the triglycerides are going to be the determinant of VLDL production. And we don't think there's going to be a whole lot of VLDL production. We think there's going to be more particles. There's going to be increased ApoB secretion, but it's going to be more in the IDL LDL density ranges.
Okay, but that is definitely a big difference, because you're quite literally pointing in the opposite direction. If you're saying the blood marker of triglycerides is the strongest indicator of like the strongest, let's say, correlate to VLDL production, full stop. And this is why, just to level set this a tiny bit more.
Sure.
Again, I should keep qualifying. This has more to do with triglyceride output from the liver. The species arrangement of the ApoB lipoproteins, exactly how many of the proportion of VLDL, how many are IDL, how many are LDL, is less relevant than it may sound when I'm saying it this way to me, because it's more about the cargo. It's more about, is there more triglycerides leaving the liver? Whether or not that was in twice as many IDLs, dropping with less of them being VLDLs, because there may be a faster synthesis rate, is not that material to me.
Okay.
What is more material to me is whether or not more triglyceride cargo needs to leave in order to meet existing demand in the periphery to replete, especially adipocytes, right? And I think that that's going to be the case. But the model, the way that you just now described, it sounds like it's the opposite, because what I'm claiming right now is that the low triglycerides in lean mass hyperresponders are not going to prove to be correlative to a lower triglyceride export from the liver. You're saying your model claims that it is. And part of why I'm making a friendly
Yeah.
challenge here is you'll want to have an explanation in your model as to how the free fatty acids leaving adipocytes at a faster rate get repleted at a faster rate correspondingly. And I think that's where the lipid energy model is meeting that answer.
I think that it's possible that there is VLDL, so esterification and then VLDL production that is actually used in brown adipose tissue to actually beige your formerly white adipose tissue. That's interesting, and I think that's possible. And I would suspect there would be low ANGPTL4 in brown adipose tissue that could accommodate uptake of VLDL triglyceride in that tissue. So I think that's possible, and who knows what sort of quantification that would take. I think that a big part of whatever we're repleting could be coming postprandially though as well. And so
you're, in your model, you would posit that the chylomicrons that are coming from the gut might meet the delta difference that we're describing in the lipid energy model.
I think the chylomicrons are key, and they're very key in the hyperabsorption state that we are seeing, and some of the data that we are seeing with ezetimibe dropping people's LDL cholesterol like 200 milligrams per deciliter with this case report and this proof of concept that we're going to be publishing. But I think that what we have to account for is there's got to be a balance. And whenever we see hypercholesterolemia, there has to be either increased production of ApoB particles, I would say more accurate ApoB secretion. Our model says increased ApoB secretion, or also clearance has to be defective. I don't think the clearance part is as affected as the production or the secretion in our model.
It doesn't, but a greater secretion of ApoB lipoproteins from the liver doesn't break LIM at all. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's some amount that's higher. I have no idea. That again, the total submarines are not as important as the cargo, and I would suspect, and I'll bet you would agree.
Yeah.
The let's call it heterogeneity of the secretion is probably pretty high anyway. I think it's more demand based on how much of the triglycerides are there in the ER and ready to get packaged and sent out. It's still the coupling that becomes the most relevant in the lipid energy model is the reason for the higher predominance of the LDL particles and therefore the LDL cholesterol being as a net result of the turnover seems to be where the models are in competing with each other. In other words, I'm trying to steelman you guys even better by saying, I think your model can accommodate that there is in fact a higher triglyceride export. It's just that what your model would posit instead of it being predominantly about the turnover in the periphery is that no, it's predominantly direct export, right? And that the degree with which there's triglyceride export is there, but like might be less than 5%, less than 10% or something along those lines. And that really the chylomicrons coming from the gut are the major repleter of the existing adipose tissue. But if that's the case, that's actually very testable.
It is testable, and that's why it's so cool that I think we can actually know with flux studies. And so that's what's exciting about this, and we'll see how close any of us are, and I'm happy to be wrong because we'll actually have it figured out, which is really cool to do these tracer studies. And so what we do think, though, is postprandially, this is pretty important because you've got these ApoB 48 chylomicron just bombs. It's like the holiday cheese ball of everything that you're actually reabsorbing from the enterocyte, and so then it's getting dumped off through the thoracic duct. And so these have so much triglycerides on them and so much cholesterol. Actually, there's like over 50,000 molecules of cholesterol on these chylomicrons. The remnants probably a little less there, but there's a lot of cholesterol there. And what's interesting about the cholesterol that is derived from chylomicron remnants is it tends to more readily enter the regulatory pool because it's very tightly regulated in the liver, the cholesterol content, the free cholesterol content, which dictates sterile regulatory element binding protein 2, which then dictates whether or not you're going to produce cholesterol, you're going to increase LDL receptors, and PCSK9. And so you're getting a lot of cholesterol uptaken from chylomicron remnants if you're in LMHR, because, you're still eating, it's a low insulin state, but you're eating a high fat ketogenic diet. Okay. So you're getting all of this absorption from the chylomicrons. You're getting really good LPL activity because you're very insulin sensitive. And then you've got a chylomicron remnant. That's going to be uptaken by the LDL receptor family in the liver, LRP1, and then also the LDL receptor. That pool of cholesterol enters the regulatory pool in the liver, which dictates nuclear transcription factors. And so because the liver satisfies its intracellular cholesterol demand, what does it do? It says, hey, we got enough. It dials down SRABP2, which dials down LDL receptor expression, and it dials down HMG-CoA reductase activity. But what else is regulated by SRABP2 is PCSK9. And PCSK9 puts your claw grabbers out of commission. It puts the LDL receptors out of order. And PCSK9 is the most potent determinant of LDL receptor expression. Now, since PCSK9, though, is low, the LDL receptor activity, the LDL receptor that's uptaking any of these LDL particles, it gets saturated, actually, and the half-life extends, and so it's still clearing LDL particles, but very inefficiently. And so there's some minority pathways, syndican-1 and heparan sulfate proteoglycans, and some of these other pathways by which cholesterol is cleared, but they're very slow and very sluggish to recycle to the cell surface. And so what happens is you've also got all this lipolysis, all these free fatty acids, and your liver's like, okay, well, I'm going to esterify this. But in the effort of using the free fatty acids to esterify the cholesterol, it's actually left with a relative decrease in intracellular cholesterol, so it has to pull it from the gut in order to satisfy its intracellular requirement, which is why we see the hyperabsorptive phenotype in lean mass, we would say hyperabsorbers. And so it is crazy. It's crazy. But
so your prediction right now is that we're going to find lean mass hyperresponders are all hyperabsorbers.
There is a relative hyperabsorption in people who have this phenotype, yes.
But when you say relative, would you say majority? Okay. Would you say 75%?
I think there might have to be a second hit. So what's interesting is not everybody. So it's a prerequisite to be somewhat lean, I think, to have this phenotype. Because people who go on a low-fat ketogenic diet, who have diabetes, diabesity, have 100 pounds to lose, everything. Even if you're just looking at lipid neighborhood on paper, everything gets better, right? But there's a certain point where people who are leaner in this state, I think you might have to have a secondary factor develop this phenotype. Because what's interesting...
By secondary factor, you're speaking to genetics, or you're just speaking to some yet to be discovered thing?
Yeah, I think it's possible because, ApoE4 carriers tend to be hyperabsorbers, and so that could be a factor there. There are certain people in our study who we've gotten the genetics on that we're going to be publishing who have variants in ABCG5 or G8. People of Asian ancestry tend to have some sort of loss of function ABCG5 more than G8.
Can I pause you on that one, though? Because this came up a few times in the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group. And part of the challenge I was running into when I was trying to investigate it is there are so many variants on ABCG5 and G8. And I'm like, so what are the ones? And the people who are proponents of that in the Facebook group couldn't identify because there were just so many different types as to which ones they were. Do you feel like you've got a list? Like, do you have a predictive list of the SNPs that might be genetic SNPs that we could actually say, okay, now we'll look into a new group? Hold on.
Oh, no, we need to. But some of these things might be really common to your point, because I do feel that everybody who ends up going on a ketogenic diet and controlling their insulin, control their life, because that's generally the purpose of a ketogenic diet, is going to be a hyperabsorber. And so that is our framework. And so we actually have titled it Lean Mass Hyperabsorbers. Okay. And what's really fascinating is and it is regulated by insulin, because insulin itself regulates Niemann-Pick C1-like-1, which is the ticket taker to the sterile party in the gut, and it also regulates ABCG5G8. And so when insulin is low, you're going to have ticket takers letting everybody in, and your bouncer, ABCG5G8, is just going to be like, I'm off duty. No thanks. And so insulin is the key to all of this. And in that persistently low insulin state, Well, we're going to have this cycle where the liver has to prioritize not getting lipotoxicity, and it does some really interesting things because it's not going to synthesize de novo lipogenesis. And so that's our framework there. The fate of what...
But in particular, just to double click on that, so you'd say the absorption itself is bringing it back to that central component of the lipotoxicity protection. So whereas we're coming at it from the glycogen source of the liver is kind of the beginning of the cascade, right? In effect, you're saying that the absorption is more the beginning of the cascade.
I'd say it's the low insulin state. It drives all of the changes we're seeing.
But there's for type 1 diabetics, they tend to be more heterogeneous on lean mass hyperresponder phenotype expression. That to me makes sense because of how much the insulin becomes relevant towards things like LPL activity. You're administering it exogenously, therefore that whole mechanism of the limb gets kind of thrown up in the air. But it shouldn't, presumably type 1 diabetics should be more prominently showing the hyperabsorption if that's the case.
They do,
right?
They do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people on a ketogenic diet who are type 1 diabetics who are leaner and more metabolically healthy, tend to be greater hyperabsorbers.
People who have type 1 diabetes tend to be hyperabsorbers. Now, we have to treat it with insulin. There has to be an amount of insulin, a sweet spot of insulin, in people with type 1 diabetes, because the normal pancreas makes between 18 and 42 units of insulin a day. And so you need that, but way too often people with type 1 diabetes are taking ridiculous amounts of insulin and they have double diabetes. And so I think if you get your sweet spot right and you get the right amount of insulin to take care of your cellular needs, you're not going to typically see those extreme levels as often. It's a no insulin state, untreated type 1 versus a low insulin state. And there's a big difference there because
we're talking insulin sufficiency or not.
Yeah,
right.
Because I would say lean mass hyperresponders have insulin sufficiency to meet the bulk of your cellular needs. It just leads to some interesting lipid excursions.
Right.
And especially because postprandially, your LPL activity is killer. It's awesome, because you're insulin sensitive, and insulin is a hormonal regulator of lipoprotein lipase. That's awesome, However, in the rest of the time, when you haven't just eaten, then there are some peculiarities that occur, and we end up with a compensatory hyperabsorption for the liver to satisfy its intracellular cholesterol component while also mitigating lipotoxicity. And so that's our framework there.
So what then explains the weight change? What explains why lower levels of body fat? You're saying people with lower levels of body fat would therefore have greater hyperabsorption.
I'm not sure about that. What's interesting about this too is there's some heterogeneity that I can't explain. There's my buddy. He was a Division I track guy too, 800 runner, and I think training like an 800 runner is a great idea for life, just for being awesome. That's my bias, but those guys are strong, fast, high cardiorespiratory fitness, and you can go throw down at pretty much anything, which is why I try to train like one, even though I'm retired and old. But so this guy, I think he's still the record holder at University of Nebraska. You could do laundry on his abs. This dude's shredded, and he has been strict carnivore, and checked him. He's in ketosis all the time for 3 years. His lipids didn't budge. And this guy's as lean as it gets, and so his ApoB started when he started it was like 75, and now it's like 79. All right. What the heck? I myself, and I'm pretty lean. Most people meet me and they're like, "Wow, you're a lot smaller than I thought." I'm like, "Thank you." But anyway, so I'm a small, lean guy with low body fat percentage. I love to mess around with everything and try everything, and I've messed around and put myself in ketosis, and done a ketogenic diet for a little bit. Mine didn't really do much either, and I'm like, well, that's weird, and so there's something odd, and there is heterogeneity with all of this, and I think it's fascinating. And so I think that for the person who goes on a ketogenic diet for whatever reason that is, which it's usually a pretty dang good reason as far as, restoring metabolic health, or the people who their lives have been changed, who have had refractory epilepsy or depression, and they've literally gotten their lives back. I love those stories, man. They're so cool, you know? And so those things are really, really great when people do that. But then when people get the really stratospheric lipid excursions, that's an interesting discussion. And obviously there's the ongoing discussions of risk and whatnot. But it's very, very interesting. And so what we're trying to do is pinpoint for people who have this phenotype who might actually also have a positive calcium score, because with all the whatever's going on out there with the next data drop and all this, I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, and that story's far from over. And that's, I said in that chapter. But what it does appear at this point is if you've been broken into, well, that's the person who, while on this diet, is experiencing, plaque progression and serial break-ins. Okay, in that person, I would say, hey, well, let's chat about maybe how to mitigate this degree of cholesterol excursion that we're seeing. And I think that would be, I think what we're trying to do with our proof of concept here and our ezetimibe paper is hopefully have something other than, just blitz everybody with a statin or whatever. I don't think that's the best tool for this phenotype, given the degree of hyperabsorption. And what we've seen in some of our data sets with these people who are getting drops of 200 milligrams per deciliter with ezetimibe monotherapy, hey, this could be a shift in how we treat this for people who may benefit from lipid-lowering therapy. Additionally, as you and others have shown, I mean, you get the right amount of a refeed as far as, the insulin, and you can, if that's the goal, get living in a safer living neighborhood. That said, I understand when people...
Just for the general audience, ezetimibe is a cholesterol absorption medication.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, I myself, again, not giving medical advice,
right,
I myself have acknowledged comfortably that it's the most popular one that's been in the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group, because, and it makes sense, it's a means by which you can lower LDL substantially by reducing the absorption that's actually coming from the gut. Now, that said, what I think the DaySprings of the world would probably say is, well, what is the efficacy that's shown for this medication versus like a statin and so forth? And again, I'm not here to adjudicate that part of it.
Right.
It's just, why hasn't there been as much traction on ezetimibe in particular in the medical world that observes the lean mass hyperresponders that are coming in? And I think that's been a big part of the challenge. So I certainly welcome any and all papers, any and all research that just gives people more options, period.
It's coming.
But that said, before we get off the model comparison game, the other one that I had that I wrote down as notes beyond the weight difference and how much the phenotype is expressed that way, because you've probably seen our meta-analysis of the 41 RCTs. It does seem to substantiate the lipid energy model with regard to the amount of leanness being how much it's expressed. To meet with your model, presumably the absorption would likewise track with how lean somebody is. The other thing is HDL. I don't actually find where this competing model can help explain the HDL tracking, particularly with leanness as well.
Yeah, leanness, I mean, HDL cholesterol is sort of like the hemoglobin A1C of postprandial triglyceride excursions, or around
Bite
the clock.
your tongue.
And so,
I have an opinion on A1C if we get
and
get
so
around to that
I mean,
one.
A1C is not perfect either, but basically, the higher someone's triglycerides are around the clock, typically the lower the HDL cholesterol is. And that's why what happens is there's this excess CETP activity, and HDL does a lot of good things, but it's kind of like a cop. It's like a cop that's out doing traffic duty and doing all sorts of charitable community things. But when there's a bunch of triglycerides around all the time, insulin resistance, then your cop gets fat and fluffy. So the HDL is giving his cholesterol ester to the ApoB particle, and he's taking the triglycerides, but he's getting fat and bloated with triglycerides. It's like a police officer who's not going to pass his fitness test. So what happens is you've got a couple unskilled surgeons, endothelial lipase and hepatic lipase, and they're like, all right, well, let's attempt a surgery on you, fat cop. and then they overshoot it. And what you're left with is a gaunt, emaciated HDL particle that's no good for anything. And it's like, oh, dang it, that was bad. And so he can't pass his fitness test because he's too gaunt and emaciated. So what happens is actually via megalin and cubalin, which is your kidney of all things. The kidney gets involved. Yay. He actually catabolizes that gaunt, emaciated HDL particle and gets rid of it. Over time, when people's triglycerides never come down because of your mailboxes are full, and these are the same people that instead of delivering triglyceride packages, the mailmen are delivering plaquages to your arterial wall, everything's going wrong. Then, what we're going to see is low HDL cholesterol. So it's sort of like an integrator of how high your trigs are around the clock. And so that's in general why we see low HDL cholesterol in metabolic syndrome. And that's why we see low HDL cholesterol as a prognostic for actually having major adverse cardiovascular events,
I think that's a component, but I would say a lot of it, and I'm drawing off of Anatol Kontouche, who's co-senior author with us on the lipid energy model paper, is the lack of turnover of triglycerides off of ApoB lipoproteins. So when you're not getting back to the personal fat threshold, which is where you were going anyway, if your adipocytes are saying, I can't take any more, right? There's a greater residence time of triglyceride-rich ApoB lipoproteins because they're failing. They're failing to deliver those triglyceride cargo to the adipocytes, and as such, there's a lower rate of the turnover for which HDL particles would pick up the surface free cholesterol, and to some degree the cholesterol esters. That turnover is a process that is somewhat new. I guess I shouldn't say super new because it even goes back, I want to say back to 78 when they were doing this originally, when they were doing examples to see how nascent HDL could pick up the surface components of ApoB lipoproteins when they were doing it in vitro. But Anatol Kontouche, I highly recommend his work. Is really good in picking up that turnover and why it is that they tend to teeter against each other. But it's also a crucial component with the lipid energy model in particular, and one that I would encourage you guys to want to incorporate a bit more into your model to at least determine how much that turnover might be a component. Because exactly what you were talking about before, when I was reading through the model that you were putting forward in the LMHR chapter, and knowing that's part of this broader paper that you guys are doing, it's true. There's a lot of things that I've been aware of and that I speak to on social media, but we only had 5,500 words for our lipid energy model. I want to be able to say things like, we can't cover everything that we know also can have an impact on LDL, but what specifically brings around this phenotype? Like if I had total control over your diet, your friend's diet you just talked about, right? You'd think that you would exhibit the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, but the engineer in me wants to get you controlled in an environment where I say, okay, no resistance training. You can do all the cardio you want. I'm going to give you a diet. It's going to be low fiber. It's going to be, high fat carnivore. And I don't predict 100% conversion to lean mass hyperresponders, but I comfortably predict 75 to 80% if I had that group. But then part of the challenge with your model, because I would have immediately started leaning on the data that we already had with our cohort, is unfortunately the phytosterol factor. So the issue is, as you know, how do we check these absorptions? We're checking phytosterol. Well, great if everybody was on a comparable diet of a mix of greens and meat, but they're not.
I know.
So for the full-blown carnivores, I can't come back to you and be like, oh, we don't see a lot of absorption in this case, because no, that doesn't disprove it.
It doesn't. No. Yeah. And that's a great point. And honestly, this is so fun, man. So two things on this, because I feel like I don't think this plane is going to land until there's kinetic studies, which is fine.
True, but with a qualifier, I just have to throw in one qualifier. There is still also a challenge of the multi-compartmental math. There's still usually some amount of assumptions baked into tracer studies, which I always knew was going to be a little bit of a challenge. We're going to hope that the math works out.
I think that the simplest explanation for why the HDL cholesterol rises is because HDL cholesterol does go up in people who are hyperabsorbers anyway. Because one of the fates of cholesterol in the enterocyte is it actually can be effluxed via ABCA1 into a nascent ApoA1 particle, that discoid pre-beta HDL. And that is one of the things that you can see in a hyperabsorber is increased HDL cholesterol. And so that's the real, just cut and dried, simplistic reason why I think that you're seeing elevated HDL cholesterol. It goes right along with the hyperabsorptive phenotype. That said,
can I add to that?
Yeah.
Anatole Kantouche, and I honestly didn't even know about this until I was reading his paper from, I don't know, like half a decade ago on this, is because of those ApoA1s coming alongside the chylomicrons, right? So you've got greater absorption becoming relevant towards the actual capture that results in the nascent HDL particles, right? And that's, yes, to that extent, this is one of the difficulties of disentangling how much of the hyperabsorption is relevant towards the internal lipid system, such that I think we've got to do more experiments. Like I'm going to show you one. Hopefully I can show this to the camera as well. I'm going to show you an experiment that I did a while ago and that I really should just like write up at some point. I'm not sure if it's going to be seen by the camera. You can see it, but
okay.
Basically, here's the gist of it. It was an eating window experiment where I got really ambitious. And what I did, and I'll just describe it because I don't think it's showing up on the camera. What I did was I quite literally took my lipids 6 times every day, right?
Wow.
I took it when I woke up. I took it at 7 a.m. I took it at 9 a.m. I took it at 2 p.m., then at 7 p.m., and then at 10 p.m., typically right before I went to sleep, right? So glucose I took, then I took ketones, right, with the Keto Mojo. But then I also took total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, non-HDL Friedwald. This was a combination of Keto Mojo and PTS Diagnostics, cardio check, right? So
let's see that triglyceride. What's that? Triglycerides. Okay.
So the triglycerides, note these are comparing 2 eating windows. Same exact diet. I was eating the same exact diet, which I call my baseline diet. It's practically carnivore. And the blue line is with a 10.5 hour eating window, 8 within 10.5 hours. The orange line is 4.5 hour eating window. And as I anticipated, my triglycerides do go up and remain elevated until I'm coming into the next morning. This is a triglyceride carryover effect, which I also cover in like some articles and so forth. But importantly, you can see just how much, even just over the course of the day, like my total cholesterol, for example, at its peak is right before I'm eating. And this is in the 4.5 hour eating window. It's up at 329. And at its nadir, it goes all the way down to 277, right? That's like a huge shift in one day, right? And these are the last 3 days of a 5-day phase for each of these that are being compared. So the reason I draw attention to this, like right now, is I feel like these kinds of things, it's not kinetics, but by golly, we can see the patterns. The patterns that I feel have taught me the lipid energy model was in doing experiments like these. I really should write this thing up. It's now like super old and I just got busy with other things. But this is the LDL when using a triglyceride proxy. So you can kind of see how much the LDL was changing, as much as like 257 down to 189 if I got it later in the day. This, by the way, also is why I get especially frustrated that they changed blood work from getting it when you're fasted versus not. If you're into metabolic health, you've got to know why that's so disastrous for us. Because not just lipids, but all kinds of metabolic markers change, of course, postprandially, like you're describing.
Flux.
Absolutely. And especially this lipid system, which for what it's worth, I think if I were on a mixed diet, would not be as expressive as it is here. It's because I'm powered by fat. It's because, as you well know, being into lipids, how these things are affected by it. But you can see how much the HDL cholesterol, really want to draw attention to it. The HDL cholesterol, literally milligrams per deciliter in my bloodstream, right, are going up to 60 and then down to 53, right? 59 here, down to 53.
I think that's when your triglycerides were highest, though, right? When it's 53.
It doesn't. It's actually not as inversely correlative as you might think.
Because they're
right. So put both of them next to each other.
Yeah.
Right.
So that still makes sense.
Yeah, but it's getting back to the turnover. I believe that you'll I believe many will see that there is a degree of turnover for which there's a major influence. But getting it, we can step off the mechanistic discussion on the model versus model for a sec. A key thing, though, I want to be sure is conceded on my end, that I think you'll concede on your end, is, models, as the saying goes, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? The concept behind what a model's trying to do is it's trying to just be the best explanation of the day.
Mm-hmm.
The best one so far of the ones we have, knowing for sure that there's things that are left off, especially for something as complex as metabolism.
Right.
Or lipid metabolism. I so welcome all levers that can be known for cholesterol metabolism in the case of lean mass hyperresponders, but just overall, how much we can understand this physiology, given how much focus there is on it.
Yeah.
Right. And so to that extent, of the other big levers, I do think absorption is very relevant. I think that if the interest is just trying to get the LDL number low, because that will be, very satisfying, then ezetimibe, I think what the heck? I'm just going to admit something right now. There's been discussion internally, and I hope they don't get mad that I'm discussing this with you here in this podcast, but there's been discussion internally on whether or not the triad study that we are going to do, it's just what the shape of it is, actually has a control group that's lean mass hyperresponders, but that take ezetimibe, because we feel very confident that the LDL levels will get lower.
Much, I would say.
Right. The issue that we're going to be running into. All right, I shouldn't talk about this, but let's talk about the triad study. I was thinking we might still have the 100 participants that are not on ezetimibe and 100 that are, and do double-blind placebo control. I have to concede I know enough about ezetimibe to know it's not going to be super easily double-blind, because you can kind of tell. You can kind of see how much you may be getting through on the other side. But that said, part of the pushback has been that it might not be as accepted as if it was something that's thought to have greater efficacy, like statins, even for the same amount of a change in LDL levels. The thing is, I feel like it's more sellable. I feel like I'd have a tougher time getting lean mass hyperresponders to, even if they knew it was a 50-50 chance for them to be randomized to the statin arm. The other thing is, I don't have as much faith that the statin, unless it's really high dose, would actually have a substantial enough change in LDL that would satisfy the critics. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think maybe this paper that we're writing will help direct those future studies. Actually, I would hope that. And so it is interesting. I don't think that statins are going to have the same benefit in LDL-C reduction, if that's what you're after, that you would see typically in this population. And then conversely, I think you're going to see an outsized benefit with ezetimibe, because if you're a run-of-the-mill person who's not an LMHR, ezetimibe monotherapy, 20-25% LDL-C reduction if you're lucky, right? So it's very, very modest, unless you're a hyperabsorber. And so I've had people who are genetic hyperabsorbers, and these aren't people with like beta-cytosterolemia, but people who they have an allele in ABC G5G8, and they get almost a 50% reduction with ezetimibe monotherapy. And so, okay, sometimes people with genetic hyperabsorption will get this a lot more benefit than you would expect than your run-of-the-mill population data. Now, with this cohort, though, and with the physiology and the adaptive response, if this ends up being across the board, if you went on a ketogenic diet and hyperabsorption is part of that phenotype consistently, then this would, I think, help inform us if we elect to use lipid-lowering therapy in that population. And so that's why I think that these models that we're working on or trying to I think it's important that they're actionable And I think that if we can show that, you know what, this is actually going to be the optimal choice if this is the phenotype and there is a reason to get living in a safer lipid neighborhood for ezetimibe, rather than statins being first line, because statins are first line across the board in your run-of-the-mill person who's, got hypercholesterolemia. You're going to say, okay, statins first line. But if the reason for the hypercholesterolemia needs some sort of treatment, then maybe this would actually be a different recommendation based on the why. Because I think it's always important why we see a level.
I think so. but this is the problem. I feel as though a lot of people, including a lot of critics of our research, I want to politely call out the consistency issue. So this is a great example. As you point out in the book, there's a lot of studies on statins. A lot. Now, set aside whatever anybody who's listening to this, their predisposed position is on any of this research, etc. Is it true that there are folks like Thomas Dayspring who say ApoB is pretty much the game on one end? But also, I listen to a lot of podcasts with him, I'm sure you have as well, also say how you lower it does turn out to be relevant. Yeah, that the issue is that it does feel very logically inconsistent unless I can hear an explanation from why that second version would become important. In ezetimibe, if the expectation is the lower LDL is going to turn out to be relevant, then yes, you're right. It should be something where if we did this as the next study, and if it built upon the current study and the lack of association between LDL and plaque progression, then that would further build on that data, right? But right now, I think that there would be, let's say that it did. Let's say that we got basically the same results we did this time. Have you followed the preliminary data that also got released that I spoke on from a few months ago?
So there was all the hullabaloo when keto CTA first dropped.
Right.
And there was the Clearly data, and that was interesting. And then, I mean, every single person progressing, interesting. And then the subsequent data sets have definitely not been that degree of either NCPV progression or PAV progression. Although the one consistency that I've seen with that, because I still am like, the story's far from over with that sort of thing. But
100%.
More
than I can talk about here.
Here's how I feel on, because after a while it's just like, I don't even know. I have a better idea of what Kanye West's next career move is than what the next thing will be. I mean, I was just like, I don't even know. So, but what I'll say is, when we have people who have a positive calcium score at baseline, those people tended to progress. Now, those people tend to progress in many studies, in many different dietary patterns, and so for me, you are more likely to be broken into if you've already been broken into. And that was called plaque begets plaque in the original thing. But I would say, hey, if there's been a break-in, your lipid neighborhood's rough and your home security system wasn't adequate to prevent a break-in. And so we're looking at serial break-ins unless we move to a safer part of town. That's my framework. And I feel, so if somebody, comes to me, they've got a positive calcium score and they're an LMHR, I'm going to say, hey, you know what? I am going to propose that we move you to a safer lipid neighborhood, and let's have a discussion about how to do that. And so now, I mean,
you would just to save you, make it easy. You would say, if somebody comes to you, they're an LMHR. This is actually, by the way, what I've asked in both of my LMHR panels at COSI. They have a positive CAC. They let's say that they had a prior lifestyle that was less metabolically healthy. They're like, okay, well, I'm a lean mass hyperresponder now. I went and got one. Let's say it's not even high, but it's not low. Let's say they're at 50% for what their age is of what a CAC is. Let's say they're 60 years old, male, and for the first 59 years of his life, it wasn't the best. It wasn't terrible, but it was standard American. right? Standard American
Standard
diet.
American disaster.
Yeah, standard
Sad,
American
sad.
disaster. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know what a 50% at a 60-year-old male would be, but let's say that's 75 CAC, right? So they're right there at the midpoint. And they turn to you and they go, look, I know I had a terrible life before. I'm sure that that's why I have the CAC that I have now. And yeah, I know my LDL is high, but I'm otherwise metabolically healthy. Can't we just like watch the CAC like a little bit longer? Now, before you answer, I can tell you that all of the colleagues that I work with who are on the who are in the LMHR research, for example, they would say, no, I'd like you to take steps to lower your LDL because A, that's the standard of care. B, they would say that that's their opinion. And as far as I know, that is their opinion. They're not just saying that out of fear of being censored or so forth. They actually think that there should be a change in lipid levels, right? I'm not expressing my opinion. I'm just carrying across their opinion. But my guess is, given your book, you would share the same opinion.
Yeah, I would, because, I mean, you've been broken into. And, you know, calcium score, the power of zero is interesting. And we have to acknowledge that this is a context of hyperlipidemia that we haven't really dealt with before. And so I think we all have to be honest about that. The reason why someone has hypercholesterolemia on a ketogenic diet is different than somebody with hereditary, you know, HoFH or something like that. Yeah. And
so let me run the hypothetical with you. We do the triad study exactly as I'm describing. Let's say it's not 1 year. Let's say it's 2 years. We have 200 people. We double-blind randomize them to either the intervention group or the control group. And at the end of the 2 years, there is no association between their LDL/ApoB levels and the progression of plaque. It looks pretty much just like our keto CTA study. Would that have any impact on your opinion?
How long is this study?
Let's say 2 years.
Yeah, that's tough. So I think, and I'm of the Cromwell school of a fire has started, let's put it out, you know, once you've been broken into, as far as that goes. And I would say, hey, you've been broken into. You've got a positive calcium score. You know, this is where we see the benefit of actually lipid-lowering therapy. And so let's talk about that. And I'll meet you where you're at there. And then what's interesting, too, is with this sort of phenotype, I think that if people are willing to recheck at regular intervals and do refeeds, you know, with some degree of a glucose refeed to spike insulin and to see where you land, I think we have more margin for error and time when someone has a CAC of 0. But at this point, when somebody, and I will acknowledge it's not based on this specific person. The reason, this person has a CAC and now is an LMHR, and we think that it was because of their standard American lifestyle beforehand. I don't know, you know, but you've been broken into, and I'm not confident that staying in this rough of a lipid neighborhood is going to be safe for you. And so I'm going to suggest you move to a safer lipid neighborhood if you've been broken into.
Let me change the hypothetical. Say it's 5 years. It's 5 years from scan 0 to scan 1, right? Sorry, scan 1 to scan 2. There's a 5-year difference in between. One group has been on ezetimibe for 5 years, right? The other group has been the control group. There's still not an association between LDL and not just calcified, but also soft plaque progression.
Was this an outcome trial? Are we looking at hard?
No, we're well, by outcome, I mean we're looking at CT angiograms, but not events, is what you mean.
And of course, we're going to have to look at events just as you always have to track.
Of course,
events.
you'd still track adverse events, but let's say that the adverse events are roughly the same.
Whenever there's new data, we always have to think about what we have observed.
And that's why I brought it up. Because right now what you're describing is where the field is at. The expectation is that there's enough data on hand that precedes the keto CTA study that even the hypothetical that I'm putting out to you, I think would be treated in the same way that you're describing right now. That even for people who have super high levels of LDL comparable to Brown and Goldstein, it's not necessarily going to move the needle for them, right? So in a sense, if I was being grouchy, I could say the lipid hypothesis as it stands today is very difficult to falsify. even with direct data, people at the levels of LDL of those with Brown and Goldstein, because of the level, and I say it's difficult to falsify because of the level of scrutiny for incoming data on metabolically healthy people with sky-high LDL. There's so much emphasis that's placed on those other populations that had a cluster of other things that both affect lipid levels and can also be independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease, which has been a chief complaint that I have. But it's established a strong foothold into the expectation that it is going to necessarily be problematic for lean mass hyperresponders. Even if we come up with more data that in the process of getting it together, observing it, actually watching it unfold, it's not necessarily going to change people's minds. That's a concern, right?
Yeah, but how about this? And so I think it would be, and this is just a very interesting discussion. If there was a clear benefit to having LDL cholesterol of 254, then I think it would be, in my mind, a different discussion. You know, if I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be just superhuman performance. I'm going to actually be able to run with the guys from Northern Arizona now and not get lapped, you know, which is embarrassing, man. You feel like you're good, and then you get lapped in a 5K on a track because those guys are running 13 flat. You don't feel good about yourself. But anyway, but let's say, you know, that for some reason having an LDL cholesterol of 254 or whatever was making me just like superhuman, and I was just like, wow, this is helping me just be awesome and do all these things performance wise, and my mental clarity is through the roof. I'm firing on all cylinders. You know, even the collateral shrapnel from the knowledge bombs I'm dropping on a moment-by-moment basis, people pick up as an artifact, you know, to go sell for something. You know, I mean, let's say that there is some benefit, you know, that it's like, oh yeah, this is because I've got cholesterol levels that would be, you know, in the past just consistent with familial hypercholesterolemia. Then I think that would be a different discussion. For me right now, it's like, okay, you know, I think best case scenario, it's, well, maybe you don't get broken into. And then worst case, this actually might be problematic. So that's where I'm at on that. I think it's okay, well, can we still have the metabolic benefit that comes with controlling your insulin, controlling your life, and being an absolute champion when it comes to metabolic health, and live in what has historically been a reasonable lipid neighborhood at the same time? I think we can. And I'm not convinced there is any benefit. I don't actually think there's a benefit to having, especially in our current context. So one could argue maybe some infectious disease benefit in the 1800s or something. But I don't actually think there is a benefit to having just the LDL cholesterol levels. I know people get benefit when it comes to their quality of life. And I know people have gotten benefit when it comes to conditions like epilepsy and depression and some of these other things. And that is not trivial, and that's not something we should ever discount. But just the LDL cholesterol level or the ApoB level, is this having any benefit?
If we don't know, we don't know, right? Do we know enough about ApoB lipoproteins that we can rule in or rule out if there's any benefit at all? Are there benefits that the body has from ApoB lipoproteins, or are they effectively a waste product?
Well, they're delivering triglycerides and phospholipids and then going home at the end of the day.
So take LDL in particular. LDL, let's even be more specific. Let's say ApoB 100 lipoproteins that are triglyceride depleted. I could wave a wand, and from now until the end of your life, you have half of those than you would otherwise have, area under the curve, right? Would you accept that right now on faith, that would be a net benefit?
For me personally, given that I know what my current ApoB is, do I feel compelled to mess with my lipid neighborhood at all? I do not. But really, that's the thing. And so I feel like,
you're not convinced that it is that specifically LDL ApoB and lipoproteins are with a high degree of certainty a waste product, or at least not beneficial to the human body?
I think that, what was that Linkin Park song in the year 2000? In the end, it doesn't even matter. No. And but what I'm saying is, I think the effect size might be minimal in a particular metabolic context at a certain level, but at a certain concentration, it might actually be harmful. So I'm not sure. And so, but here's what I think. So
at a certain concentration going down?
No.
Or concentration going
now
down?
It depends why it's low too, and that's a good discussion. So it depends why your LDL cholesterol ApoB is low.
See, I agree with exactly what you're saying, but technically this goes against the present day lipid hypothesis, because the present day lipid the nature of causality itself is that the reason for the why is less important than it, right? So there's an analogy I like to use, which is the reason for why people enter a volcano relevant to the association between them dying or not? And the answer to that question is no, because entering a volcano is itself the causal factor to why you die.
That's a bad idea.
Yeah. Now, what about entering a hospital? Is the reason why a person enters a hospital relevant as to the association between that person dying in a hospital?
Sure.
Right? It is, because if you're a medical personnel, you're going to die less. So this gets to Simpson's paradox. You want to make the distinction. You want to say, hey, there's an importance to the reason why somebody's in the hospital.
Sure.
So if I'm being devil's advocate, I'm saying, why do I feel the need to keep drawing attention to these things, these disease clusters, like insulin resistance syndrome, that does two things at the same time? It both is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease all by itself, and also it changes your lipid profile.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, if you have an intervention that changes both those things, how sure can we be that one of those causes the other? In particular, how much can we be sure that, for example, remnants, right, which are not LDL particles, how much can we be sure as to their a distinct atherogenicity causal impact? My answer to that is we can't, because you're still looking at it when they're all together.
It's the milieu.
It's the milieu.
And that's an interesting thing too. I think that what is interesting is that conversation of all the conversations are interesting actually, but I'll circle back to why LDL cholesterol being low in a minute, but remnants are interesting too. And so ApoE, right? And ApoE is best known for its role in the central nervous system because it's ApoE HDL-like particles that are the primary traffickers of cholesterol in the brain. And that, people who have ApoE4 copies tend to have at baseline a greater risk of Alzheimer's disease. It's not deterministic, but we can get to that later.
It's associational, right?
And so it doesn't mean, I'm going to get Alzheimer's. No, you might have a little less margin for error, but I think that you can totally abrogate that with the right, proactive interventions. But anyway, so ApoE though is on VLDL and IDL particles, and ApoE is actually the preferred ligand for the LDL receptor, ApoE for easy access. And so those particles tend to be readily cleared. However, if those particles aren't cleared and they're loitering and they have ApoE on them, guess what? If they get in the arterial wall, they don't actually have to be oxidized in order to be retained there. And that is bad, So the ApoE remnants shouldn't be loitering. They should be being hydrolyzed, their triglycerides should be hydrolyzed, and they should be going home at the end of the day. And that's what happens in insulin-sensitive states. However, in insulin-resistant states where we have all these remnants and they're loitering, guess what? That ApoE on that particle, that is bad if it gets up in your arterial wall because it doesn't actually have to be modified in order to be retained there and set off the maladaptive immune response that results in plaque formation. So I think that it's possible, but what's the milieu that drives that? Insulin resistance, diabetes. And so trying to disentangle the two is really hard, but it is interesting how those remnant particles have unique characteristics that, those are bad guys.
It's not hard if we study the population that has sky-high LDL,
but no
sky-high
remnants.
ApoB, but no remnants, right, and doesn't have insulin resistance syndrome. That's lean mass hyperresponders. But I'm running into this challenge. The challenge is you still have such an entrenchment of the present belief that even eliminating all of those other confounders is still going to be difficult for people who believe in lipid lowering in the first place. If you're already of the mind that the LDL particle is itself problematic and that this milieu is an accelerant, well, the main issue with the lean mass hyperresponder research, you might posit, is that without the accelerant, it's still going to happen. It might just be slower, but you should still take action. You should still do something about those sky-high levels of LDL and ApoB, right?
I think it gets back to, do you have to have those levels? And now the thing is, there's some in this particular context. Like, let's say that we started people at 20 years old and we're like, all right, you guys be LMHRs, and the rest of you do whatever, but we're going to try to...
Which IRB
yeah, right. I mean,
board is going to approve that.
Right,
I'm
right.
interested.
And so, but, let's, and then we have like the actual, long term. I mean, that's not going to happen. That's not even practical, right? And there's so many things that you would have to adjust for, and it's like, all right, well, what about people who are just at the highest cardiorespiratory fitness? Seems like nothing matters when you're at the highest level of cardiorespiratory fitness, right? I mean, you take the guys who are crushing it at the highest level, and
over exercisers,
except for those guys. And so it's interesting though, and I don't know, and so it's hard to say. That said, I don't think, and we have other things as far as why is the LDL cholesterol low. There's a big difference between being yellow, and having hepatic failure. And yeah, your ApoB is low there because you can't produce anything, and your clotting factors are low too, and you need a transplant.
But that's super important because you discuss this in the book. You talk about A-beta lipoproteinemia.
Oh yeah, terrible.
And there's an important distinction that you're drawing to in the book that many other people on the lipid side wisely draw, which is that there's a big difference between whether it gets into circulation, which is the entry point, versus the exit point, which is whether it gets cleared. And there seems to be clearly a high relevance as to whether ApoB lipoproteins make it into circulation in the first place. So getting to your broader question, as I know a lot of people would ask as well, wait a sec. Do you have to be at an LDL of 400? Do you have to be at an LDL at 500? I mean, you've gone on this way of life. It seems to have helped you a lot. You have epilepsy. You're seeing all these benefits. Is it really that big of a deal for you to take ezetimibe, for example, right, in order to bring those LDL levels down? And my pushback default, just with any kind of intervention, is what's the data behind the value of that intervention? And presently, the data behind the value of the intervention for lowering the LDL levels is in these populations for which there's these clusters. How they get lowered is an interesting topic, but what we find is it is not, as is often presented to us, ubiquitous. I know it often is claimed to be, but then you get somebody like a Thomas Dayspring, and you're like, oh, okay, so if we use ezetimibe, will it be about the same as if we use statin? And a lot of people, like our good friend William Cromwell, would say, well, there is a difference. We see a little bit of value here, we see it there. And if I'm trying to steel man it for them, I think if I'm them, I'm saying, well, there could be other as yet to be found reasons as to why this given intervention or that didn't do as well. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say certain interventions that result in lower LDL and also result in benefit deserve to be in this category that gets meta-analyzed to support the larger hypothesis. And all those cases where it doesn't gets excluded from the meta-analyses, including failed drug trials. I have a good reason to be complaining about that, right? Because you're still coming to the conclusion that lean mass hyperresponders should take action to lower their LDL given these other populations that don't have that commonality. And that isn't to say that I've made the conclusion that they shouldn't. I've not. And there's a reason why I'm comfortable repeating what other people have said, even though that's not me, that I'm not giving advice. I just don't want them to feel they're excluded from this conversation when they're a part of the research for it and they themselves are doctors. But I do still want to be the consummate, I think, sciencey minded skeptic for any intervention that's assumed to be beneficial without data behind it when we are actively collecting data. We are actively gathering the data that we need. Now, as you put it, Hullabaloo or whatever
Hullabaloo,
it was, Hullabaloo from April 7th was, I think, and maybe I've got a little fire in my belly given recent events, not all of which I can share due to lawyers and so forth. But I will say that I have a little fire in my belly in that there's been kind of a natural experiment of sorts. We got to watch the clearly data that came out that seemed to be attached to by a lot of people who are pro-LDL lowering, but seemed to be inconsistent with the lipid hypothesis at the same time. So even if you believe the clearly data was accurate at the time that was getting released, there was still this problem that there was a lack of association. And the exposure to the association absolutely should have been observed, at least at baseline. At baseline, given nearly half a decade on this diet, you would expect Brown and Goldstein level patterns of some kind to have appeared. And I think that was something that the research team themselves thought that this was something that was truly going to be considered novel. But I don't think it was. I think that as we watched in real time, it was actually thought to support the lipid hypothesis, which is why I kind of get back to how it may in fact not be that easily falsifiable if all versions of the data as it arrives seems to either be supportive of it, or therefore it seems to be something that's considered a one-off and not to be considered.
Yeah, I was the first clearly data sets. I was surprised, and I was like, oh, that does not look good. Especially the 2.4% PAV. I mean, 1% is a rapid progressor, and conversely, 1% regression is correlated in meta-analyses with a 20% reduction in MACE. And so when I look at these things, and I look at PAV as far as that goes, as far as plaque burden, I was like, oh no, I mean, I didn't like that. I don't like that.
I'm going to correct you slightly, but to also support you. What you're referring to is it went from the average was 1.6.
I think the average was 0.8, but the 2.4% of people who had CACs of elevated CACs who progressed, those were the people that progressed like majorly. The people who had CAC scores of like 100 or greater.
No,
or
that's
like
that actually. Oh yes.
Yeah.
The people had 100, right?
Yeah.
But the one of the first big clues that had me wondering and results in a lot of activity, I'll just say, behind the scenes of me addressing clearly was those who had a CAC of 0 were almost 3.5 times faster progressors than those who had a positive CAC, which we've never seen in any data set ever.
Yeah,
there's a reason there's a power of 0, right?
Yeah.
That the thing that you brought up before, which is that there's never also been total unanimity of progression where there wasn't a single regressor in that data set. And that's really that and a few other things I had in the presentation is all I've been cleared to discuss. But I have a report that I've alluded to that identifies 24 different things. Like I said, there's a formal process going on behind the scenes right now. But it's another reason why, but I do want to bring it up with regards to just science philosophy. At the end of the day, Josh, either we're truth seekers or we're not.
Yeah.
Right? Like either we have our own worldview that we've been promoting and we want to be like, no, I think I'm right about this. And at the point at which data comes, if it doesn't support your existing worldview, yes, our natural instinct is to be like, oh, it's not supportive. I'm starting to see problems with it. It's a skill that we have to develop to be scientists because I don't think it's built into the biology. I think we have to actually proactively train ourselves to challenge our own beliefs on a constant basis. And social media has kind of carried around this interesting, like I said, natural experiment that I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I guess this podcast is for things like this. I'm kind of thankful for what the clearly data brought me with regard to the landscape, because now I see the landscape, especially since the preliminary data came in. All the voices you were hearing a lot when the clearly data came in, have you been hearing them much since the preliminary data came out?
No. And that's what's interesting too is, I mean, there's a lot of groupthink. There's a lot of everybody seeking
On all
confirmation
sides.
bias on all
On all
sides,
sides.
right? And so for me, and of course I'm biased because I write books about these things and I think they're fun. But I feel like, hey, I like where I stand on the things I feel are axiomatic, as far as no one should ever strive to be more insulin resistant. Nobody in 2026, which is coming up, is like, you know what, my goal is to be closer and closer to type 2 diabetes. I mean, no. I mean, if I could pick one thing not to be, it would be insulin resistant. So I've chosen not to be, gosh darn it. So that's, I mean, honestly, that is king in my book. And then no matter what people tell you, and I've had lots of patients and, they come in, their blood pressure's 220 over 140, and they're like, oh, I saw a squirrel on the way over here. I got all excited. It's like, sir, you're about to have a stroke. I mean, that's not okay. That's not your normal. The inflammation thing is interesting, but if your inflammation is because your body resents your chronic state of overnutrition and it's from angry adipose, also not good, and then don't do meth. And so, all of these things, as far as I feel very good about the 4 pillars of the home security system. The lipid neighborhood is wild, and it requires context. And I feel like we have imaging that better informs our decision-making process. Like, CAC is wonderful, and then there's, more bells and whistles for particular situations and whatnot. And, if we want to go there, but, hey, the lipid neighborhood, I learn things every day about the lipid neighborhood.
So at some point in the middle, this is a new thing we're doing. This is from the Own Your Labs desk, as we call it. And they give me a question to give to you. And this is based off the book.
Okay, right on.
It's kind of, I'll just be honest. We were trying to figure out different ways to very subtly mention, this is Own Your Labs, which is us, is a sponsor of the podcast. And we're trying to keep it like as ad-free as possible.
Yeah.
But mid-roll ads are like so annoying. And so we're like, oh, you know what? We'll work it into being something interesting. And
okay.
So I got a question.
Okay, cool,
There's
cool.
the text on it. Regarding Lp(a), on the 10th kringle is an oxidized phospholipid.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, how do you know this to be true? And sorry, this is actually a bit technical. Let me see if I can set this up a little bit for you. So the Lp(a), we've already talked about it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ApoB lipoprotein, but it has a tail. The tail has multiple kringles.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, I guess, on the 10th kringle, you say there's an oxidized phospholipid.
Yes.
Does it start with an oxidized phospholipid on its
no,
tail?
it carries oxidized phospholipids. So it goes around and it has high affinity for oxidized phospholipids. And so what's interesting is there is actually on Lp(a). So one of the reasons why Lp(a) is considered to be very problematic, especially if it's in the arterial wall, is because it carries on Kringle 4 subsegment 10 oxidized phospholipids. And those, so it's interesting, this leads to a pro-osteoblastic cascade in your vascular interstitial cells. So bone in the aorta, for instance. You shouldn't have bone in the aorta. But what happens is when the oxidized phospholipids on Kringle 4 subsegment 10 get in your arterial wall and it's recognized as foreign, this results in bone morphogenetic protein 2 being upregulated in your vasculature and leading to calcific deposition. And so because the receptor for this is in high concentrations in the aortic valve, that's why Lp(a) is also associated with calcific aortic valve stenosis. This is based on a lot of the studies that people like Marlos Kaczynski and Michael Boffa have done as far as trying to analyze why the heck Lp(a) seems to be so nefarious and why it's an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease.
But it's an acute phase reactant, right?
It rises as an acute phase reactant too.
And isn't it part, I mean, as I understand it, Lp(a) is also a part of the, I don't know if I'd say clotting cascade, but I would say doesn't it work with, for example, fibrin with fibrinogen and so forth in creating
it has homology to plasminogen because so the LPA gene on chromosome 6 is right next to the gene that codes for plasminogen, which is your clot buster. And so we actually don't fully know why Lp(a) exists. We've known about it since 1963 and still don't know how it's cleared from the body or exactly why it exists. Now,
but I thought that when we look at
wound healing is probably
exactly
wound healing,
because we see a lot of its presence in wounds. And again, I want to be polite and not jump to the conclusion that other people haven't investigated this as closely as my very basic level of. And big shout out to my colleague Siobhan Huggins, who, by the way, has also done a complete talk on this, which you can find at cholesterolcode.com/LPA. But I know she was very interested because she has genetically high levels of Lp(a). I was asking her, and I think she's investigated, how much do studies that look for people who have even genetically high Lp(a), but that control for other acute phase reactants, how much is there an association with the development of cardiovascular disease? And at least at that time, and I want to qualify, this was in 2018, 2019, at that time, she couldn't find any studies. And that's a hugely important thing because, once again, if we're looking in the milieu of an otherwise inflamed individual where other acute phase reactants such as C-reactive protein are increased, as well as Lp(a), when it is a part of wound healing, that's a very relevant clue. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, so Lp(a) is interesting, and there are studies that show that people who have obesity and diabetes and high Lp(a), you're even worse off. Well, of course, I mean, that is no surprise. And so I think really what it comes down to is, okay, do we feel like this is problematic in the person, without any sort of metabolic syndrome or other risk factors? And the Lp(a) is interesting, and we're still figuring out its function. I think that because it, like to your point, people with keloids, the hyper scars, people with these raised scars, those tend to stain for OXPL, ApoB, and those people tend to have higher Lp(a) levels. And so that's interesting. And
not just there, but in the serum.
Yeah, in the serum. And so that's interesting. And so I think they're like super healers, so to speak. And one of the theories of why Lp(a) exists is it was kind of an insurance policy for when getting mauled by a saber-toothed tiger was an easier way to die, or when, let's say, postpartum hemorrhage was even less manageable, something like that, And Lp(a) does go up a little bit during pregnancy. So there's some interesting things there. What's interesting, too, is just some of the other trials and when Lp(a) remains an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, even when people are treated with statins. And statins actually increase Lp(a). Okay, that's interesting, too. So there's a lot of really interesting things about Lp(a). And it's, I think we still need to learn about exactly who's the person who, we're really concerned about and who's the person who has an Lp(a) of 400 nanomoles per liter and has no disease, which I know people of all these things. And so I've seen lots of patients. And
Nick Norwitz has extremely high Lp(a).
Some people, and I had a colleague who she had not a shred of soft plaque even on a CT angio at age 65. And her Lp(a) was like 560 nanomoles per liter or something. That's interesting. And the thing is, why don't we study her? Because my friend who, 128 mgs per deciliter was my friend's Lp(a), who had no issues consistent with an impaired home security system. And CAC of 2,814, 5-vessel cabbage. And I've had other patients who their one risk factor is Lp(a), and, by all other metrics, they look fine. And these are younger people, 34-year-old or whatever, and they already have a positive calcium score. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. Now, could it be other factors? Could there be? Yes, but the one thing that's standing out is the Lp(a). And so I don't know. It's interesting. Lp(a) is a really, really interesting character.
It's why we should be studying those people who have elevated Lp(a) but otherwise low inflammatory factors. Which brings me back to keto
100%.
CTA, because we have unpublished data. Because I fought for and got an Lp(a).
Oh, really?
Test.
That's interesting. That'll be good.
Do you think there's an association between Lp(a) and plaque presentation or plaque progression?
Small cohort. I think the biggest predictor is going to be already having plaque at baseline, calcified plaque at baseline is going to continue to be the one thing that really stands out.
As the predictor of future plaque progression.
Yeah.
Right. But that LP(a) won't be?
I'm not sure. We'll have to see.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I would say it here, but I think my research partners would get upset with me. I have to tell you something funny, which is that part of how I'm able to get a lot of people to do what they do for free, because it's a charitable effort, right, is that I do have to allow for them to publish off data that we're gathering because they've worked to help to get the data. But I have to concede, if it were just up to me, just release all the data.
Oh, yeah.
Like I wish we just had more effort towards capturing the data and just reporting it straight up.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
I may get my way at the very end of this study. We'll see. But
I mean, at the end of the day, really, when God gives a gift, he wraps it in a person. People matter. People are awesome. And all of us share the common goal of not wanting to have a cardiovascular event and wanting to crush it with all the years that God gives us, right? That said, people tend to get very, very tribal in whatever, and wherever you stand on any of this, Even if your stance is, quote, neutral, which I would say the home security system in lipid neighborhood is a fairly middle ground stance-ish, and yet you can be pretty bullish on that sort of stance, I guess. I mean, especially if you write books about it. But at the end of the day, what's that person in front of you doing? And what is that person, are you willing to meet that person where they're at? And if you've had the blessing of learning some stuff and researching some stuff and not just saying, I've learned it all, we're done, the case is closed. No, actually being enthused about the possibility that we might need to shift paradigms. Why wouldn't you want to do that, given that people's lives are at stake? And that's a bigger conversation than whatever perceived realm of expertise you have or whether or not you're trying to get on the Mount Rushmore of lipidologists, And I think that we all would do well to just take ourselves down a notch and just think, okay, what have I been given and how can I use what I've been given to hopefully help other people on their personal health journey? And if we do that, and yeah, we might have different ideas of how to get there, but at the same time, if the foundation is correct and the reason why, it all comes back to the reason why you're doing what you're doing. If the reason why people are doing what they're doing is just so that people are like, oh man, guy's so smart, or oh yeah, that's an expert, that's not a good reason. But if your reason is, wow, I have been blessed with an understanding of some stuff, acknowledging humbly that there's a lot that I don't know yet, but I'm trying to figure it out because I can help people with what I've been given. That's a good reason to do what we're doing. And that's why me and Austin and a few other guys call ourselves the Fellowship of the Lipoprotein, because, we're riding, through the minds of groupthink and trying to, hurl all these just tribalisms into the fires of Mount Doom, and because just we want the best for people. And, I don't know, that's why I try to do this. And I hope that people, recognize that. And ultimately too, when you get to conversations that even transcend the physical and the biochemical, into something actually beyond what this temporal realm holds, I think those are really worthwhile conversations as well. So it's a fun deal.
What would you say is something you've learned in the last year, especially with regards to lipids, that have really opened your mind?
Yeah, so the ANGPTL family. And the ANGPTL family... One
of my favorites.
Yeah, it's kind of, there's always some like Instagram influencer who says something to the effect of, I'm the kind of crazy you never knew existed. And it's usually somebody that you don't want your daughter to grow up being like. But with the ANGPTL family, I think that's what that statement was meant for, because the ANGPTL family is the kind of crazy that you never knew existed. And for those of us who have taken, lipid board exams and things like that, generally what you're taught about the ANGPTL family is, and this would be ANGPTL 3, 4, and 8, and this is angiopoietin-like protein 3, 4, and 8. And so all these things are just obnoxiously
which we cover
long.
in the Lipid Energy Model paper, by the way.
Which is really, really interesting. And it's regulated by insulin, though. See, control your insulin, control your life. And so all these things are regulated by insulin. What's interesting about this is what you're historically taught is, oh yeah, it just inhibits lipoprotein lipase. And that's just pretty much it. Let's move on. But really, it's fuel partitioning that the angiopoietin family is related to. And so basically, insulin regulates all these things. And so angiopoietin-like protein 3 makes a complex with angiopoietin-like protein 8. ANGPTL8 has no activity on its own, but when it partners with either 3 or 4, then it actually exerts biological effects. But the effects are different depending on the tissue and depending on the context. And so after feeding, angiopoietin-like protein 3 and 8, they complex together, and they tend to partition triglyceride uptake into adipocytes. And so that's their role there after feeding. Conversely, ANGPTL4 is elevated during fasting. And what it's doing is it's inhibiting LPL and adipocytes. Because when you're fasting, do you want the triglycerides going into adipocytes? No, you want it going to oxidative tissues. And so it's funneling the triglycerides over to myocytes because, hey, you haven't been eating, which is preferable to not be eating all night long. And so you can actually have your muscles be utilizing those triglycerides, and that's where ANGPTL4 funnels it away from the adipocytes there. That is really cool. However, when insulin comes along, increases ANGPTL8, and it binds to ANGPTL4/8, it actually will inactivate ANGPTL4, and then it will actually partition the fuel into the adipocytes postprandially. And so it's this amazing system and so elegant of just fuel partitioning. What's wild about it is the link between feeding and clotting, because when ANGPTL4/8 makes a complex, it actually binds to TPA and plasminogen. And when it binds to this, it actually cleaves plasminogen into plasmin. Plasmin is your main clot buster. And so if ANGPTL4/8 complexes fail to form or form inappropriately, it can actually increase your risk of clotting. And when do we see people fail to make ANGPTL4/8 complexes? When you're insulin resistant. And so, guess what? Yes, diabetes associated with increased risk of venous thromboembolism. And what's interesting too is sometimes the oxidized phospholipids on plasminogen, which actually are not bad if they're on plasminogen, they are more likely to hop on an ApoB particle. And when they're on an ApoB particle, probably not so good if those complexes fail to form. And so that to me, I was like going round and round and reading this stuff, and I was like, oh man, Aunt Barbara was right when she said it's all connected. Eating, clotting, all the things. ANGPTL. So that was really cool, and I had to write a chapter about it in the deep end of the community pool. And for all the listeners here, most of what we're talking about here is in the deep end of the community pool. There's no lifeguard on duty. Enter at your own risk. And so a lot of the rest of the book is actually, the topics are not quite as granular, but it's all fun. It's all fun.
I have an analogy you might like when talking about ANGPTL. Like, imagine a cocktail party and there's waiters that are wandering around and they've got, hors d'oeuvres on their trays. And everybody, if left to their own devices, will just pull things off of those trays. And what you're doing with ANGPTL is you're saying stop to some people in the room. Hey, everybody who has a black coat, don't take anything off the trays. We're leaving it for everybody who's in a white coat, right? Because the interesting aspect of it is that these cells, they're in the dark. They can't see over to these other organs, save these chemical signaling molecules that are coming their way to tell them stuff, like insulin. Right? The biggest, loudest one.
Yeah.
So you have an adipocyte that's like, well, I'm just going to go ahead and make lipoprotein lipase. I don't see why. I mean, that's my job. My job is to take fat off of lipoproteins. That's why I make the lipase, to get the fat off the lipoproteins. That's my thing. I store it and so forth. I'm going to keep making it. So only when something comes along and says, don't make it, slow down, right? Make less lipoprotein lipase. Oh, okay. And so that's how it ends up taking less from the lipoproteins in circulation. Why? Because at that moment in time, there's a proactive effort to steering the partitioning in the way that you described. You need to steer it to this other tissue. But conversely, when it's time to store, there's a reason to be like, no, let's go ahead and go crazy with your lipoprotein lipase. Feel free. Take as much of that as you can at this moment in time while we're in a state of abundance, which is further helped by specifically this anabolic hormone.
Yeah, yeah.
That it's funny how many times I've had this discussion with regard to fasting insulin, because it's so straightforward. The one major anabolic hormone, the one right there on your shirt.
That's right. Control your insulin, control your life.
You fasted for 12 hours. Why are you in building storing mode? Why? You've not consumed any food. You've slept overnight. You wake up and your insulin is above 10 milli-IU or worse, above 20 milli-IU. I've had some family members, I don't want to say how high I've seen it. One family member, I saw it up at like 45.
I got 128 the other day.
Fasted. Like, at that point, and that's why they need to think of it in this fashion. I believe that Joseph Kraft should have multiple Nobel Prizes by this point in time. And his work is 50 years old. And he saw this then. Looking at glucose levels, fasted glucose levels, does not tell you much at all compared to fasting insulin.
Yep.
Because your pancreas will pick up the slack.
Oh, yeah.
For a long time. Till it's too late.
I mean, insulin resistance and prediabetes and diabetes, I mean, it's like being almost pregnant. You either are or you aren't. It's just a matter of how far along you are in that disease process. And if we can identify insulin resistance in its infancy and do something about it then, that is the same thing that we're talking about as far as trying to be preventive in all the other ways, And so one of the stories I tell in my book is a beautiful example of my wife. My wife is absolutely gorgeous Italian Spitfire. She's half Sicilian, half Puerto Rican. Va va voom. And so
I can imagine the counterpart of both of you.
Oh man, she's amazing. And so I highly recommend marrying your best friend. All you kids. Why would kids be listening to this podcast? But anyway, all you people out here. But anyway, she's phenomenal. But anyway, so she wasn't she was feeling kind of sluggish or whatever, and she gets some labs, and her LDL cholesterol is like 78 or something, but then I like to get the advanced lipid panels as far as NMR spectroscopy, especially in people who are true primary prevention, and so, but what was interesting is her particles were discordantly high. So her LDL particles were 1300 and her small dense LDL particles were elevated, which is typically associated with insulin resistance.
Do you know that number offhand?
So it was probably, I think it was around 630. And so 527 is usually kind of that middle point. And so, but a lot of
come back to that.
A lot of small dense LDL particles. And so, and typically, from Jerry Schulman's work at Yale, insulin resistance starts in skeletal muscle. And then when you start moving, well, you reverse that skeletal muscle insulin resistance. And she hadn't been exercising at the time. And so what was really fascinating is, she didn't change her diet at all, which was, not as monastic as some of us and not what I would say is ideal by any stretch. But she went and started exercising, combination resistance and aerobic exercise 3 times a week. Nothing crazy, but just consistent. And at 3 months, rechecked, LDL cholesterol didn't budge, went from 78 to 80, but the LDL particles went from 1300 to 994, and the small dense LDL particles completely normalized. As far as, I think she was in the 350s or something, from upwards of 600.
What were your triglycerides?
Normal. And fasting insulin was 4.
But when you say normal, what were
above 75.
100? Okay, so
yeah.
75.
So 90, and triglycerides of 150 is not normal. Oh my gosh. And that's 75th percentile even. But a fasting triglyceride of 95 is where there's an inflection point to a pattern B, which, B for bad, and that's predominantly the small dense LDL species. And so Ron Krauss has shown that in some pretty elegant work. And so if you're going to use a normal triglycerides, I would still say you should be below this, but 100 is still probably a little too high. 95, I like to use 95 because of that inflection point to where you see that pattern B.
You're in friendly territory. I've always thought that having triglyceride, the present day, not guidelines, I want to say reference range, but also guidelines. I think they have it at 150. Actually, it's funny. I don't want to call him out, but I want to say there's a prominent lipidologist who is saying, well, if it's above 400, then you need to look at it. But I was like, what? No, I likewise, just in playing with NHANES data, but also in everything that I've been able to read up until this point, I think you want to be mindful of it being under 100. Again, fasted.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth emphasizing people who, just as I was showing you with my day-to-day patterns, it's worth emphasizing if you are keto and you take a non-fasted lipid test, you are likely going to have higher lipids because you have lower bolus and basal insulin, and the body doesn't act on triglycerides like it does on glucose. Glucose, it tries to keep in a much tighter delta of homeostasis than triglycerides. In fact, triglycerides are hardly acted on at all. Now, whether or not that's problematic, obviously I speculate that it's not, because it's just a matter of being at a lower basal insulin state. But if not, then we'd see lean mass hyperresponders develop, ever progressing diabetes everywhere.
Yeah. What's interesting is when they occasionally will do like oral fat tolerance test, or a mixed meal test. They'll do that in certain studies. And it is interesting to see some of the agents, and obviously they're looking at usually drugs with these things. They're interesting, though, as far as what mitigates postprandial hyperlipemic excursions. And so there are certain agents that tend to attenuate the rise in triglycerides. Most of the people they're testing on have some degree of metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. And so they tend to get crazy high spikes that you don't really want. And so ezetimibe actually attenuates postprandial lipemia quite nicely. And PCSK9 inhibition actually does too. So that's interesting. And those are just more interesting sort of things that you observe every now and then that aren't routinely done, where they give people like a high-fat milkshake or a mixed meal, and these people, their blood looks like coconut milk, and it's like, that probably isn't good. But and it's interesting to see the effects of certain agents that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have that benefit. I think you'd expect when they use like the incretin therapies, the GLP-1s and tirzepatide, things like that, you'd expect to probably see an attenuation in those excursions with those agents. But when you see that with other agents, it's just kind of an interesting thing.
Let's talk about Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So you get into it in the book, and you allude to, there was a very personal story that seemed to really spike your interest in it.
Yeah, and so big difference between living and existing. And my grandmother actually passed away about just a little over a year ago from complications related to Alzheimer's disease. And it just breaks your heart. And almost everybody has been affected in some way, shape, or form by dementia of some kind. And the neurodegenerative disease spectrum, it really is kind of a continuum, because there's a lot of overlap between vascular dementia, between Alzheimer's disease, between Lewy body dementia, and even things like Parkinson's disease. These things have distinct protein signatures, and Alzheimer's disease has amyloid beta as its signature, which then leads to something called tau hyperphosphorylation and neurofibrillary tangles. But what's interesting to me is, of course, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is Alzheimer himself, the first thing he noticed were toxic lipid droplets accumulating in the brains of people that were having cognitive impairment. And that's interesting. And most of these central nervous system disorders are characterized by disturbed lipid trafficking. And so that's a really, really interesting thing. And so it got me down the rabbit hole and down deeper and deeper and full-fledged into, a PhD dissertation on this. But basically in my framework for Alzheimer's disease, I think there are three essential core lipid defects that we observe in people who develop this disease. And the first one is impaired cholesterol transport. And cholesterol is critical. I mean, every cell in your body, synthesizes, every nucleated cell in your body synthesizes its own. So a lack of cholesterol is incompatible with life. But 20 to 25% of total body cholesterol is in the brain. And what's interesting about brain cholesterol is it's actually the astrocyte that's supposed to synthesize the cholesterol, and then it's supposed to be delivered via the ApoE HDL-like particle, because it's in the density range of an HDL, to the neuron. And then the neuron can actually incorporate the cholesterol into its lipid raft domains, where it is a hub for signal transduction and synaptic transmission. And so this is what's supposed to happen. But unfortunately, in the Alzheimer's brain, you see decreased cholesterol transport. You see cholesterol accumulating and lipid droplets accumulating in places where it doesn't belong. And then we have oxidized sterols like 7-keto-cholesterol that are accumulating in the wrong places. And then what's interesting is we actually see decreased cholesterol synthesis. And so it negatively feeds back. These when cholesterol is accumulating in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's actually negatively feeding back on global cholesterol synthesis in the central nervous system. And so these are pretty consistent things that we see across the board in people who have Alzheimer's disease. And so that's an interesting thing. But really what I believe is the amyloid-centric viewpoint. I think that the amyloid accumulation and the subsequent tau hyperphosphorylation is really secondary to impaired substrate utilization, i.e. fuel partitioning, and then downstream the lipid disturbances that occur because you aren't properly using substrate effectively. And one of the reasons for this is because amyloid beta itself, the production rate and the clearance are almost equal. Under normal physiologic conditions, the production rate's like 7.6%, and then the clearance rate's like 8.4%. And so, it's just like, okay, it's just this happy medium. But when that clearance rate is minimized for whatever reason, and you're having an abnormal production rate of amyloid beta, probably as a consequence of impaired glucose utilization and or other substrate utilization in the brain, then we have a problem on our hands. And really the ApoE4 story, I call it ApoE Thor because Chris Hemsworth, he plays Thor, and he has 2 copies of ApoE4, which is said to have like an 8 to 12x risk of Alzheimer's disease. It just gives you less margin for error. And the reason for that is because the ApoE4 particles in the brain, they tend to not be as easily lipidated with the cholesterol that they're supposed to give to the neuron. And so they're easily distractible. And so it's like that person who's like, hey, can you put that on my desk? Oh, sure. And then they get distracted and they leave a mess somewhere else. And when these ApoE4 particles are leaving cholesterol messes somewhere else instead of delivering to the neuron, well, the microglia, the inflammatory in your cells in your brain are like, what the heck, this is annoying. And so they mount an inflammatory response because they're annoyed. And so in the process, though, the neuron's like, I need cholesterol. So the neuron starts to synthesize its own ApoE, and it can synthesize its own cholesterol. But when you're asking the neuron to do things that the astrocyte should be doing for it and the ApoE particle should be doing, you're asking for burnout. And when that persists long term, I think that's really why we see these changes that do result in amyloid beta accumulation and hyperphosphorylated tau. But for me, I think it's downstream of impaired glucose utilization in the brain and then the downstream lipid disturbances that occur in those people that develop cognitive decline.
What would you say to a patient that's trying to avoid this?
Yeah, and so control your insulin, control your life. That's what I would say to that patient. And so, what's interesting is in general, what's good for the heart's good for the brain. And so when we see people with coronary disease in midlife, they have a 29% increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Insulin resistance, 2.2-fold risk, or hyperinsulinemia, I should say, 2.2-fold risk of Alzheimer's disease. Midlife obesity, 4-fold increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Diabetes, 56% increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so all these things are like, okay, yep, that's par for the course, And then conversely, we see people who exercise, 45% reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. People in the highest cardiorespiratory fitness have the least incidence of dementia. Conversely, people with the highest CAC scores in MESA have the highest incidence of dementia. And so there's all these things that kind of make sense. But then it's like, once we get into actual specifics, there is very poor correlation in general with what we're seeing below the brain on lipids with what's actually going on in the central nervous system. So in the UK Biobank, elevated ApoB in midlife is associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, why is the ApoB high? We need to know that. We need to know that. But, conversely, what's interesting too, and you'll think this is really interesting, in the UK Biobank, same study, LDL-C to ApoB ratio was inversely correlated with Alzheimer's disease. Interesting, right? Okay, so these things are interesting and lipids are complicated. The one thing that's really, really interesting too as a lipid-specific biomarker though, and Dayspring has brought this up, is desmosterol. So desmosterol is the penultimate precursor of cholesterol in what's called the block pathway. So the 37-step cholesterol synthetic pathway is bifurcated, and there's the Cann-Dutch-Russell pathway, and it's big time when it's got a hyphen there, between Cann-Dutch and Russell. And so the penultimate precursor there is lithosterol. And then for the block pathway, the precursor is desmosterol. So below the brain, the Cann-Dutch-Russell pathway predominates. And so typically you're going to see lithosterol prior to cholesterol below the brain. But then in the brain, it's always opposite in the brain. And so in the brain, it's actually the block pathway that predominates. And so you're going to see desmosterol be the penultimate precursor. In general, these correlate very poorly with what we see, CSF versus what's going on in plasma, except for desmosterol. And with the cholesterol balance test, it's a marker of cholesterol production. And so what's interesting is in the Helsinki Businessman study and also a similar Japanese cohort, people with the lowest desmosterol levels, meaning lowest cholesterol production, those are the people that develop Alzheimer's disease. That's interesting. And so could desmosterol actually be a useful biomarker for us trying to prevent neurodegenerative disease? Possibly, and if we're seeing somebody with low desmosterol levels, ApoE4 carriers tend to be lower producers of cholesterol and then hyperabsorbers at baseline. But let's say that somebody is on a statin, and you're over suppressing cholesterol synthesis and you get your desmosterol levels and it's really low. Is that somebody that you might want to consider throttling back on that, or, maybe using something else if there's a reason to get living in a safer lipid neighborhood? There's certain people that operate like that. I think it's an interesting discussion. What we have to acknowledge, though, is the Helsinki Businessman study and that Japanese study, they were lipid naive. These people had low desmosterol levels and they progressed to Alzheimer's. They weren't on any lipid-lowering therapy. Okay, but, do we want to be crossing the blood-brain barrier with an agent that suppresses cholesterol synthesis? Well, you can probably think about that. But, it's an interesting discussion. We have a lot to learn. But what's really important, I think, is giving people hope. Then the best prescription I can give anybody is hope, because right now it's like, oh, what do you do about it? Well, control your insulin, control your life. That's always the answer. But I think that biomarkers right now that are more specific to neurodegeneration are improving. And for some reason, there aren't a lot of people signing up to get brain biopsies or get cerebrospinal fluid taps. What is wrong with people? Let's get a
trend going.
Yeah, I know. So people are weird, and it's just obnoxious. But no, so it's been historically kind of difficult to ascertain this kind of data. But what's really neat is there are some blood-based biomarkers that are actually correlating quite well with amyloid PET scans. And those have quite a bit of radiation too, and you don't want to go to that well all the time. But the biomarkers are improving, things like p-tau217. There are some non-specific markers of neurodegeneration, like neurofilament light and glial fibrillary acidic protein. But there are some things that it's kind of out there in the theoretical N of 1, everyone's an N of 1 realm. But what's really cool is Kellyanne Neotis. She's a preventive neurologist. She's a really cool cat. So she has had some patients that she's worked with, and she's had an aggressive lifestyle intervention. It's individualized based on people's biomarkers, their ApoE genotype, all these things. And she's tracked them, and she actually does the cognitive assessments too, and she's qualified to do that. I wouldn't know what to do. Someone the cognitive assessment, I'm like, hey, I'll quiz you on the African nations and their capitals, because I know those, but I don't know, what would I do? But she actually does the cognitive batteries as well, and she's seen some really cool data that she's presented at certain conferences I've been to. Of reduction in the biomarkers, but most of the time it parallels with a reduction in visceral adiposity, yep. And it parallels with an improvement in substrate utilization. And honestly, and here's the thing, I could be wrong about this, but if I had 2 copies of ApoE4, my wife has a copy of ApoE4 herself, and so this is very.
I'm a 3/4.
And you see, I have my best friend, I have friends, and there's lots of people, who have copies of ApoE4, but honestly, if I myself had 2 copies of ApoE4, I might be wrong. I don't think I'd ever get Alzheimer's. And now I might be completely wrong on that. And
I'll concede I'm not actually honestly worried about it.
And I, you know what? Just all the things I know, which is limited about your current metabolic status, I'm not either. I'm not worried about either. And, now worrying, concern would be a better word, because I don't think worrying is typically a a good route unless you just want to sap your joy in the journey of life. But, but concern, I mean, obviously we're going to have appropriate concern, and I am concerned about the well-being of anybody that I share a conversation with, random people on airplanes, people at my church, anybody who I'm once I know you, I'm invested in whatever is going on in your life, right?
I think, me personally, and I've discussed this on the podcast before, I'm more concerned about my sleep and stress levels than anything else. And that I'm confident has a lot of existing data behind it on neurodegenerative diseases, because
sleep, man.
Yeah, you can't get around those.
Sleep.
And
it's so critical. Oh, I love sleep. Okay. So, I mean, sleep is delicious. I'm one of those guys who, I feel like I'm a fairly high energy sort, and rapid metabolizer of caffeine, so I can go all day and just steady drip, or not, but anyway, that doesn't matter. But people, they sometimes will hear me talk, and I talk pretty fast, or they'll, I write a lot of stuff, and they're like, how'd you have time to do that? Or whatever. And they're like, do you ever sleep? I'm like, oh, yes. I sleep like a champion, not to brag. But, I mean, I love sleeping. Sleeping is so delicious. And I'm one of those guys, too, that if I don't have anything going on, because this is incredibly stimulating. Why would I want to sleep right now? We're having too much fun. But if we weren't having this conversation, I'm that guy who can just go and nap for like 20 minutes and then pop up, And so naps, and there was this one study, because we all like to cherry pick things sometimes, where napping was associated with higher brain volume. And I'm like, see, Krista, this is my wife. I'm like, I see when I need to nap, because apparently my brain's big. She's like, shut up. But anyway, so it's always fun to find things to justify what you want to do sometimes. But, anyway, so yeah, but sleep is so critical. And one of my favorite studies is they took these 20-something-year-old kids, height of their mitochondrial powers. They had done oral glucose tolerance tests. They had no signs of insulin resistance, nothing, And they deprived the half of the group to less than 4 hours of sleep a night for 5 days. And then the other half just slept however much they wanted. And after 5 days, half of the sleep-deprived group had levels consistent with prediabetes on their OGTT. After 5 days, it takes a long time to just be binging at the local buffet and not doing anything else in life to get to that point, And yet 5 days, it can perturb your metabolic milieu that rapidly.
Not surprised at all. And we seem to be going full circle, where at first it was thought the brain was responsible for everything. Then the more we discovered all kinds of adipokines and various, signaling molecules, we're like, oh, there's actually a lot that's happening outside of the brain's connection. And now it seems like we've come back to, well, actually, no, the brain is often at the table in some regard with so many of these different aspects. And sleep, you absolutely need you need closing hours for your neurological health. And so, yeah, I've shared this before on the podcast, but it's actually an ongoing concern of mine, because I genuinely have difficulty sleeping. And there's other things that I don't share that are relevant to it, but I do feel that a lot of the work that we're doing is, and I know this because a lot of people write into me, it's very consequential to a lot of people. And I need, to some degree, a healthier level of distance.
Yeah.
And I mean that in a, just genuinely in a recognition of the human aspect of what we're doing. But it's a process, a little bit of it's just me working on it myself. I want to jump into something you made a distinction on in your book that is not given as much attention as I would think that it would be by more people interested in metabolic health. And it's how you mentioned that fructose is uniquely metabolized. Would you like to go into that?
Yeah, so fructose is interesting. And so if you're training for the Tour de France or whatever, or you're just exercising, fructose can immediately go and replenish glycogen stores. Okay, that's fine. But what's interesting about fructose is it doesn't actually elicit an insulinogenic response. And so you might think, oh, well, that's good because we don't want to be spiking insulin. Well, maybe not so much. And so it actually leads to a transient intracellular ATP deprivation. And so your cells think that they're actually still hungry. And so you're actually depleting your cells of intracellular energy. And coupled with that, there's no feedback inhibition. And so you think that you need more energy. And so this is why fructose and fructose beverages in particular, and people will just be pounding it. And fructose uniquely will turn on lipogenic enzymes, SREBP1C. That's, an enzyme that is regulated by insulin, but it's also turned on by fructose consumption. And what's interesting, too, is fructose, similar to alcohol, actually, will disturb the NADH to NAD plus ratio in both the cytosol and the mitochondria. And what happens with that is instead of actually, producing ATP, it's actually a sign that's like, okay, well, we're gonna kind of shut down the process here, and turn on lipogenic enzymes. And that's why fructose uniquely has a role in fatty liver production. Additionally, fructose and alcohol can increase uric acid levels, and uric acid itself is a bad guy. Uric acid is really, really interesting. And most people are aware of uric acid having a role in gout, and that's actually, the intra-articular manifestation. Like once in your joint, it can crystallize and, cause your big toe to be the size of Nicaragua or something, But what's actually really bad about gout from an intracellular standpoint, is uric acid itself inhibits two enzymes that are really important in metabolism. One's enoyl-CoA hydratase, which is the second step in fatty acid oxidation, and using fat as fuel, kind of important. So it shuts off your ability to use fat as fuel. And then aconitase, which is actually an important Krebs cycle enzyme, and people are getting post-traumatic stress disorder from like, I remember when I had to memorize the Krebs cycle. Well, the Krebs cycle is kind of important, because if you can spin that and then you can actually convert that energy into something positive in the electron transport chain, then you're going to keep on being able to be efficient at crushing it at life. And so it basically puts the kibosh on fatty acid oxidation and your mitochondrial function both at the same time. Additionally, uric acid is actually interestingly associated with CAC progression. There's a couple studies that show that. And so uric acid is generally kind of a bad guy, but very, very amenable to lifestyle changes, And so it's very rare. I had a couple guys actually, and I think the organic anion transporter 2 is what is generally affected in people who have hyperuricemia of more hereditary origin, but most people respond really beautifully to low carb diets when it comes to if they have hyperuricemia. But then there's a few that didn't. And what's interesting is, sometimes people will use like allopurinol or one of these xanthine oxidase inhibitors if they're using a medication. Not my favorite. SGLT2 inhibitors will actually reduce hyperuricemia, but a lot of the positive effects metabolically of SGLT inhibitors are recapitulated by carbohydrate restriction. So it's all interesting, but at the end of the day, uric acid can be pretty bad, and fructose itself can stimulate some things that you don't really want when it comes to metabolism.
So you don't come off to me as somebody who's a one-size-fits-all, keto cures everything necessarily, but you are acknowledging where a lower carb diet seems to be of benefit to a number of people.
100%. Yeah, and the thing is, like, a lot of it is what are you doing, your activity level too, and so, for me, I coach cross country, I run around with kids, I do CrossFit, I sprint a lot, I do all sorts of things that require glycolysis as far as ATP production. In general, we should, as stimulating as this conversation is, we should be withdrawing from our savings account, which is fatty acids, and not really utilizing the dollar bills so much, which is glucose. However, when energy production demands are rapid, you're going to need some glucose on board, I think, to be optimal. What's interesting is the amount of carbohydrates that has historically been suggested for even athletes who are doing things requiring glycolysis. It might be a little more, or it might be a little less than what you need, as far as the recommendations might be higher than what you really need, but I'm not sure.
It's because once you find out just how limited the bank is of actual glycogen that can be stored, it's shocking.
Oh, yeah.
People don't even realize it's actually much less. Basically, as I like to describe, if you think of the fridge is your glycogen stores, right? The fridge of this house, if that was the glycogen stores, literally every other room would be the fat stores, stocked, packed full. And that might actually be incorrect. It might even be larger than every other room in this, in this house that we're in. But it's also very relevant to what you just now described. Why is activity level so important? Well, because you're not topping off your glycogen stores, forcing it into a state of de novo lipogenesis, because that's what the body's going to do with the excess glucose. It has to, because it wants to. It goes, oh, this is great. We're in a state of abundance. For the last 2.5 million years of the human species, we pretty much had one problem, and that's scarcity. We haven't really had much of a problem with abundance. So when there's abundance, let's go for it. Let's try to store this. Getting back to these differences in stores, I typically say the same thing that you're saying right now. What's your activity level? Because if you're somebody who runs a lot, your fridge keeps getting emptied back out again, right? So you're not getting to the point where you're topping off. Where I get worried, and I've seen it many times in my own family and friends, but I see it also just, on social media, is athletes who have a career of, an average of 5 years or something at a professional level. Some of them correctly change their appetite when the activity level changes. Some of them don't. Some of them.
Oh, those guys are disasters too. As far as those guys get real skinny fat in a hurry.
Right.
And that's not the way you want to be. And even people who are just, let's say they're just doing endurance exercise and not actually pulling the resistance exercise lever, because heavyweights aren't going to pick themselves up, those guys can actually have metabolic syndrome, and yet, I'm running 4 times a week, slogging through their, miles or something, but that's all they do. And so I think it's important to obviously resistance exercise across the lifespan too. And, skeletal muscle is just a sink for glucose and for glucose disposal. And nobody ever said, I wish it was weaker also, And so movement is incredible and so useful in many ways, but it's not just, I'm going to be a, mitochondrial maven of aerobic exercise, or, I'm just going to go over here and lift weights. Do both, and so because a lot of people are kind of extreme. I mean, people are extreme anyway. People tend to gravitate towards what they're good at, which is reasonable. I mean, there's a reason why you don't see me on ice skates, because I suck and I don't even like it, and so you tend to gravitate things that you have more aptitude for, and then you tend to hang out with people who will drink your Kool-Aid and agree with, that's human nature. But at the same time, exercise isn't supposed to tickle. There's probably, you probably have to pull it a little harder than being there on the recumbent bike and, doing some tricep kickbacks with pink weights. That's not going to cut it. And so
I tend to find people come in one of two flavors. Either they really are the type that you can schedule going to a particular very planned kind of exercise, like going to the gym or something like that. Or they tend to like some kind of activity, some kind of play, either a game or, like you were talking about with ice skates, some people are into that. But I do think, getting back to it being a skill, we used to be more of an active species, definitely in the Western world, and knowledge work has brought us a whole lot of luxury, but by the same token, comes at this cost, right? We don't really have to go out. Whenever I go to Europe, one of the things that I can appreciate there is transportation will necessitate an amount of movement. You even if you're taking the train and then you're getting onto a bus and then you're walking a little ways to then go on to the tube, but then you have to get through the turnstiles and all the other stuff. You're on your feet to move around and get places typically, right, in Europe. And also their food portions and spacing out, that's all good as well. But importantly, I feel like if I'm living in Europe, it's more likely than not that I'm going to get some amount of outdoor activity just based on trying to get from one place to the other. Whereas here in the US, I've walked to my garage, I'm in my car.
It's too easy,
Yeah, just a few steps into the office, that's it.
And I mean, we're very blessed to live in, where we are and stuff. But at the same time too, a little bit of adversity is what creates you, and makes you who you are. And, some of the most, I went through some really, really painful experiences that I alluded to early on, but those made me who I am today,
Right.
and I believe that we try to be stewards of our physical health, and we try to be stewards of whatever faculties that we have. But I also think we can be stewards of pain. We can be stewards of tribulation. And I think trials either make you bitter or they make you better. And I know in my life, a lot of people they need to just man up and get through something, right? For me, I actually needed to realize that I wasn't strong enough to handle certain things. And sometimes you go through things in life where, some people will say, oh, God never gives you something you can't handle. No, sometimes he does on purpose give you something you can't handle so that you learn to rely on him to carry you through. And that's really what I've had to experience in life. And I'm grateful for it, because out of some of the worst experiences of my life and some of the most painful, excruciating circumstances in my life, being life flight, I almost died. I was life flighted actually at one point. And they found me in a bush face down. My blood sugar was 28. And so,
Wow.
and a lot of that was, some of it was some peculiarities, but some of it was my own stubbornness. And I needed that. I needed to be shattered. And I'm grateful for that, because it's only sometimes when you have to hit ground zero that you can be molded into who God wants you to be. And, I'm so blessed. And that's, it's an interesting thing. But most of the things in life that are worth achieving, you had to go through some stuff.
Whew. I wish I could share as much as I'm currently experiencing right now, but I will in time. I'll just say at the time that we're recording this, which is December 8th of 2025, I definitely can relate to what you're describing. But it's 100% true. And I have a thing that I lean on that served me well through my life, which is that every story you ever like watching or reading, there's the hero's journey. What is the hero's journey? Well, you can look it up right now, but it involves a lot of overcoming, which involves a lot of suffering. It involves a lot of going to dark places and then finding your way to the light. And that it's almost all versions of the hero's journey is not that the hero brought it upon themselves and it's entirely by their own design, but that there probably is some degree of that. That's part of the overcoming. Well, so whenever I deal with a whole lot of suffering, I often console myself with, well, it makes the story more interesting. Because how boring would it be to tell a story where everything just fell into place and it all worked out for you? And no, what makes us interesting are our scars and the stories behind them, and the why. Why did you persevere? How did you overcome? That's interesting.
Yeah. The documentary is about the rich kid who was given everything, and then because his parents were alumni, he ended up getting free tuition at the Ivy League school. No one watches that, that's not cool. And so, but we see things like Rudy, and we see all these sports stories of the guy who against all odds, was able to persevere. That's what gets you fired up. And it's cool. And there's a lot of beauty in that, and just all of the things that create the stories that make you and make me. I mean, that's what I think people gravitate towards, and people want something real. And when you can also tell people, and my patients that I've seen, hey, yeah, you know what? Sometimes you are given a hand that is so unspeakably hard, but I'm here for you, and I've been at rock bottom myself. It allows you to help people in ways that you couldn't otherwise. And I know that I couldn't understand being so sick, and people who I have seen who have chronic illnesses until I myself, for about a year and a half, was very debilitated myself, And so it's not like you want that to happen, and it's not like, oh yeah, that was a good time. It was the worst time. And yet what, God and I'm, and I always allude to my faith, but Romans 8:28 is one of my favorite verses, and it says that God works all things for the good of those who love him, are called according to his purpose. You know what it doesn't say? It doesn't say that all things will be good. No, actually, it's promised elsewhere that all who live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So there's going to be some hard times, right? And this side of heaven, I mean, this is an imperfect world, right? We go through stuff, and there's sickness, and there's Alzheimer's, and there's all these things that, and a lot of these things we try to prevent, and that's why we're having this discussion, and a lot of it comes down to control your and control your life. But at the same time, it's an imperfect world, and, it gets ugly, it gets messy, and, even from a relationship standpoint, I mean, people you love will turn their back on you, and it just hurts so much. And yet, there's beauty. There's beauty on all of this, and I can sleep at night very, very well, knowing that I don't know what the future holds, but I'm confident that I know the one who holds it, and that's what keeps me going.
I'm interested in entertaining this segue a little bit more because of the fact that, when I started this podcast, I knew there'd be a lot of stuff hovering around lipids anyway, just because not only is it a topic I like to talk about, but as it turns out, a lot of the guests like to talk about it with me. One of the challenging aspects is me sort of feeling out what it is that I might find I want to talk about on the spot, or that I could anticipate that I'd want to talk about, but that might in its own way be controversial or take me into the realm of something else. I appreciate that you do feel a level of openness with regard to your religious standing, with regard to your faith, and that's an important part of your life. And I feel like a lot of people in your position would be a bit more guarded and concerned that, for example, a lot of people in science are atheists, for example,
for sure.
Including colleagues I work with very closely. Yeah. But I myself, on a personal level, I don't know that I'd be considered agnostic, but I like to say I'm an unknownist. There's a lot for which I think that there's a lot of latitude for possibilities, but that I just genuinely don't know. And that I tend to find is another fascinating thing about us as a species, is I think we reach for an answer that's in the unknown and seem unsettled until we get there. And I seem to feel like I'm a little bit in the otter space of being like, no, I'm actually comfortable with that being kind of an open-ended question. Yeah. And, to the degree that we can find out, we find out. But I also don't want to feel like this is a place where things can't be talked about in that regard. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So this being an important thing to you, I'm curious, how much did this become a part of your life after versus before your depths of sickness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the time that I grew the most spiritually was certainly during that time where I got incredibly sick. And I think that...
Can I ask before that your parents, are they themselves religious? Or?
Yeah. My and just full disclosure, I say I am a Christian saved by the grace of God, and no denomination or anything like that. Just I am an imperfect person, and I believe that we are all imperfect people. And if people do not acknowledge their imperfections, I think we're dealing with something else there, as far as some crazy degree of delusionment, right? And so none of us are perfect. None of us know everything. We are all flawed humans trying to do the best we can. But I believe that God is perfect, and I believe his standard is perfection. And the wages of sin is death, and eternal separation from our Creator. And none of us, even if we're trying to do the right thing, we're trying to be altruistic, we're trying to be good people, I don't believe we can meet that standard. It's an impossible standard. And yet, I believe that he sent the one sinless person to ever walk this planet, Jesus Christ, who lived the sinless life you and I never could, died the criminal's death that we deserve, and then defeated the power of sin and death by rising again. And because of what he has done, we can be reconciled to the holy God who is perfectly just. And that's what I believe. And that's what I was taught by my dad growing up. And not just taught, but I saw it lived out. Because ultimately, there are a lot of people who claim the name of Christ, and I wish they wouldn't. They drag it through the mud, and they will claim, to follow Christ, and then you see the opposite in the way they treat people. They don't treat people with the love of Christ, the love that would lay down one's life for someone else, and that's unfortunate. And so people tend to observe this, and people who you claim to be Christians, but nominally or just by observation or something else, they turn people off to that. And so, but with my parents, they truly do live out the love of Christ. Those people, they do 4 services at nursing homes every single weekend. They go in there and they just love on those people. Why? No one's making them do it. Not many people even know they do it, and they just do it because those are people. Those are special people, and they love them. And that's really what it's about. And I talk about things that are important to me. I talk about lipids and I talk about Christ. That's about it, right? And then try to have fun, And so, but really,
and so getting back to your illness, you feel like that actually brought you more.
I was selfish. We all are selfish. None of us need to get better at, being, I need to invest more in myself. Well, and we try to be stewards of what we have, but we come out of the chute, real selfish. And so we have to learn how to actually prioritize people above ourselves. And so my idolatry and my identity was based on how good of an athlete I was. And I basically was going to cast everything else aside just for the selfish pursuit of my own athletic achievement. And when it was taken away from me, that's when it was like wow, God, forgive me for being such a poor steward of all of these things. Please help me just use what you've given me to show people you and show people the love that you've shown me and the mercy you've shown me. And for me, it's a matter of, I don't do things and I don't do, service things and altruistic things because I'm like trying to get points with God or something. God's not lucky to have me on his team, but I believe he put me on the team, and what a privilege it is to be his ambassador and to try to, even in, scientific circles, which in general are, feel that science and Christianity are incompatible. Hey, I will be that iconoclast. And so, but I believe that when you look at all the complexities of lipids and things, whatever you believe about the origin of the universe is not a scientific discussion. It's a matter of what you have faith about historically, because no one was there, But I believe that all the elegance of these things in metabolism testifies to a master designer. And I don't think it's a big stretch to believe that there is one sovereign being who created all of this, and we're trying to experience the amazing privilege of getting inside peeks into what he hath ordained. And so it's a privilege to be able to explore it. And so, and I bet you that's a minority view in this sort of space, and I'm okay with that. So
I've got a minority view on a number of things.
Yeah. You know how it is to be that. But ultimately on this, I believe I can, it's an interesting discussion. It's like, if life ended today, where would I go? I'd be in the arms of my Savior. And why am I certain of that? Not because of anything I did, and of course it requires faith. But it's just a submission to the absolute authority and sovereignty of my Savior. And I think that in and of itself, it requires faith, but it requires humility as well.
Now you actively teach, right?
Yeah,
That-
yeah. So I've actually, the one thing I didn't go to school for was to be the youth pastor at our church outside of Boise. It was more of the guy who was doing the youth ministries at the time, he abruptly had to leave. And so I was in town for a couple of weeks. I'm like, oh, well, these kids know me. And do you know what VeggieTales is?
Oh, yeah.
So I was Larry the Cucumber for many years. And I would do the voice and they'd be like, it's the real Larry. Wasn't the real Larry, but I let them think that. And so I knew most of these kids, when they were younger at our vacation Bible school and they were in the junior high school group. I was like, okay, fine. I'll take them on a few rafting trips or something while I'm in town until they find a permanent replacement. It ended up being me. So anyway, so I've done that for 13 and a half years actually, which is crazy. So anyway, that was an unanticipated thing. And it's just one of those things where it was sort of all right, well, here I am, I'm willing. And, God really has blessed that in ways that I never could have imagined.
That's cool. It's fascinating because I think that whatever somebody's reason is for having a call to service, there should be a universal acknowledgement that that's a good thing, right? Like the service itself, like what you just mentioned with your parents, that's so laudable. I was, with regard to this research work, I remember through much of my life, I've been writing checks as my version of charity. And I would regularly say to my fellow engineering friends, well, thank goodness for these people who actually volunteer their time. My way of helping out is that I'm going to provide money, which is not nothing at all. That's actually, it's something that I'm relying on now on the other side.
Yeah.
But I could not imagine at all any scenario where I'd be literally donating not just hours of my time, but weeks, months, years. And now it's fascinating because it's a recurring conversation I have with my same engineering friends who, gosh, I'd be making so much more money with them if I was making the next generation gambling platform here in Las Vegas. But at the same time, I'm saying, yeah, I know you guys feel like this is such a huge waste of time by comparison because I'm at my peak earning potential right now. I could be doing so much better, but you have no idea how fulfilling it is. You have no idea. Yes, even for all the ugliness and the stress and the crazy accusations, I'm fascinated by the things I read about myself from other people at times, but that pales in comparison to some of the emails, the messages, the meeting these people at conferences that I get to be a part of, helping them hopefully get an understanding of where they're at, but also just if this is the way of life that they want, that we're helping to get them the answers. I cannot compare it to anything else ever that I've ever experienced. And that's all I can do is try my best to convey to other people that I used to be like them. Yeah. I used to not think it was possible that I could ever experience something like I'm experiencing now.
You can't put a price on it.
No, you can't. You really can't.
Because stuff, you can have it all. It's all going to burn. But what's special to me, we have an appreciation box at my house, and it's just cards. And sometimes when I'm feeling particularly disillusioned with things on this side of heaven and, reading through the book of Ecclesiastes, which I tend to do a lot. King Solomon had some good stuff to say about these things, but I'll go back and I'll pull out the appreciation box and I'll just go through the letters and the notes that people have written to me over the years. Patients, youth kids I've coached. And, it helps get my attention off my own sort of existential
right.
angst. And instantly I'm thinking about them. And I'm thinking about what a privilege it was to be involved in their life and that it meant something to them. You can't put a price on that, man. And that, if our house was burning down, I'd probably just grab the memory box, man, and the appreciation box. I of course, my family, I wouldn't let them burn, but really, that stuff matters, that you cared. And honestly, no one cares how much you know till they know how much you care. And that you were able to leave an indelible imprint on somebody's life at that moment in time. That's good stuff.
All right. I guess this is a good spot to wrap. Josh, where can people find you?
Yeah. So thanks for having me on here. What a blast. So anywhere there are sophisticated lipid discussions going on, you can probably find me, or there's a good game of Ultimate Frisbee going on. But you can find me on LinkedIn, and I post a lot of stuff on there, and some of it is just hopefully designed to make you laugh, make you think, make you happy, make you just consider the deeper things of life. But you can find me on there, and you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, and there are some real deep discussions on there with Lipofan, who, another shout out, Lipofan, Clint O'Mealy, Austin Dudzinski at ApoDuds, as he is well known to a lot of you. And his threads are great. I mean, his threads are, if you like it in story form, that's kind of like my book, what his regular threads are. He does a great job with that. I guess I'm on Instagram because I was going on a lot of podcasts and people started tagging me, and they just told me to make a profile. I don't even know what I'm doing on there.
With me. I have 20,000 followers, but I hardly ever touch it.
I don't know what I'm doing on there. That's for a younger generation. I'm too old, I think. Not cool enough. But I'm on there. You can find me, I guess. And then, if you're not a creep, on Facebook, which I know is kind of a dying entity, if you direct message me, and you have some stuff that I'd be happy to help you out if I can, if it comes to metabolic health / lipids, and, just hopefully be able to, join you on your journey. And if I have some, 10 cents here and there that can help you proverbially on your journey, then I'll offer my insights there if you want to reach out to me on that platform too.
Lastly, your book.
Oh yeah, my book. So, so my book's called The Home Security System and the Lipid Neighborhood. You can just check it out on Amazon. I think it's like $8 or $9 or something. The first edition, the remixed second edition for the clinician and anyone on a mission for more lipid tuition, because sometimes you're compelled to rap about these things. And I've been known to rap at cardiology conferences if that's what the people want. That is also available. There are multiple deep dives there. There's an endocrine thermostat section there as well. I would recommend for most people the initial edition. I think that's the best edition, and it has the audiobook too if you'd like to listen to that.
Audiobook's great.
Yeah, I narrated it. I figured it was me or Morgan Freeman, and he was busy or something. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just do it. And I think it was fun. And so anyway, like I said earlier, I hope you laugh a little, learn a little, and then come away with a relatable framework for not having heart attack, strokes, and dementia. And hopefully it brings you a little clarity and hilarity to the cholesterol confusion, because sometimes laughter is still the best medicine.
Thanks for coming on, Josh.
Thanks.